Hey there and welcome back. If the day behind you has finally loosened its hold, and you are ready now to let it slip away and travel somewhere far off, into another country and another century entirely, then you have come to exactly the right place tonight. This is the hour for a darkened room and slow breathing and the soft gold of a single lamp, and it is for you, whoever you are and wherever you happen to be lying as you listen. Tonight I want to take you to France, to the glittering Renaissance court of the Valois kings, 500 years ago, and to tell you the story of one of the most extraordinary women who ever lived there, a woman who did something that seemed to defy nature itself. She was a widow, dressed always in black and white, and she captured the heart of a king 20 years younger than herself, and held it completely and faithfully for the whole of his life. While time stole the beauty of other women, hers seemed only to deepen until the entire court whispered that she had made some secret bargain with time. She raised herself to a height of power that no mistress of a French king had ever reached, built the loveliest house in France, and reigned beside the throne as though she and not the queen were the true companion of the king. And then, on a hot afternoon in a Paris street, a single accident in a tournament brought the whole shining structure of her life crashing down in the space of 11 days. Her name was Diane de Poitiers, and by the end of this evening you will have followed her all the way from a noble childhood under the shadow of the scaffold to the summit of the most cultured court in Europe, and from there to the quiet of her great residence, where she ended her days a fallen queen in all but name. Before we set out together, let me say a quiet word to you, the one listening now, because it matters to me who is travelling along on an evening like this. If you find that these long, unhurried journeys into the past are a good way to loosen the grip of the day and drift gently towards sleep, then you are very welcome to subscribe and to come wandering through other centuries with me again on other nights. And I would love to know where in the world you are listening from this evening, and what the hour happens to be where you are, whether it is the deep middle of the night beyond your curtains, or only the first soft dimming of the afternoon. I look through the little notes that people leave far more often than you might imagine, and there is something steadying in the thought of so many of us, scattered across so many countries and so many separate lives, gathered together for a while inside the same old story. So settle yourself however you are most comfortable. Let your shoulders come down and your breathing slow, and let us go together into the France of long ago. Picture this: a summer evening in the 1550s, and the light is going golden over the valley of the river Eure, west of Paris, where a vast white house stands among its gardens and its woods. This is the Château of Anet, the most beautiful mansion in all of France, and it belongs to the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Its courtyards are cool and still in the late light, its fountains playing softly, and everywhere, if you look, you will see the same two signs repeated, carved into the stone and worked into the ironwork and set above the doors. One is a crescent moon, the emblem of the huntress goddess Diana. The other is a pair of letters entwined, an H and a D, twined together so closely that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. They are the initials of a king and the woman he loved, and they are stamped upon this house and upon palaces all across France, as boldly as if she were his wife and his queen. She is neither. She is his mistress. She is nearly 60 years old, and she has ruled his heart since he was a frightened boy of 7. Tonight we are going to find out how a widow in mourning became a living deity, and how it all came undone. So let us go back to the beginning, to the France into which she was born. To understand the world that shaped her, you have to picture France at one of the grand turning points of its history, in the time around the close of the 15th century, when the long darkness of the Middle Ages was beginning to give way to the brilliant new dawn of the Renaissance. For centuries, France had been a land of castles and knights and feudal lords, a realm still half medieval, in its habits and its mind. But now a new spirit was sweeping up from Italy, a spirit of learning and art and realmly splendour that would transform the whole life of the nobility. The French kings had marched their armies into Italy and come home dazzled, their eyes open to the marvels of the Italian courts, to the painting and the sculpture and the graceful new architecture, and they were determined to bring that loveliness home and make their own court the equal of any in Europe. At the head of this transformation stood the king who would dominate the age, Francis I, who came to the throne in the year 1515, and who poured the energy of his rule into making France a place of magnificence. He brought the powerful Leonardo da Vinci to spend his last years in France. He built and rebuilt his chateau along the waters of the Loire in the new Italian manner, and he gathered about him a court of unprecedented splendour, a court of poets and scholars and artists, of dazzling festivals and elegant manners. It was a court that prized not only the old knightly virtues of courage and lineage, but a new ideal as well, the ideal of the cultivated person, graceful in body and mind, learned and witty and refined. In such a court, a noblewoman had to be more than well-born. She had to be accomplished, elegant and clever, yet beneath the glitter, the France of this age was still a hard and dangerous place, and the splendour of the court sat atop a society of iron hierarchy and absolute royal sway. The king ruled by the grace of God, and held in his hands the lives and fortunes of all his subjects, and to enjoy his favour was to rise, while to lose it was to fall, sometimes all the way to the scaffold. The great noble families competed without cease for places near the king, for the offices and the lands and the honours that flowed from his hand, and the court was a scene of dazzling beauty and deadly intrigue at once, where a smile might hide a knife, and a single misstep might end a career or a life. It was a world that demanded both charm and nerve, and it rewarded those who possessed them with a magnificence that the rest of the realm could scarcely imagine. Such was the France into which Diane was born, and in which she would make her extraordinary career, a country balanced between the old court and the new, between the sword and the book, between the rough certainties of the feudal past and the subtle dangers of the Renaissance court. It was a world that asked much of those who would rise in it, a quick wit and a cool head and a perfect command of oneself, and Diane, as her long life would prove, possessed these gifts in fuller measure than almost anyone of her time. To the family that gave her to this realm, and to the circumstances of her birth, we turn first. This was society into which the favourite was born, and it was the perfect stage for her particular gifts, for she was to prove herself a mistress of exactly the qualities that this new age prized. She would be cultivated and graceful, disciplined and clever, a woman who understood both the old code of noble honour and the new arts of elegance and self-presentation, and who combined them into a personal style so commanding that it would carry her to the very summit of the kingdom. She belonged by birth to the old feudal nobility, the warrior aristocracy whose blood ran back through centuries of service to the crown, and that proud inheritance would shape her all her life. But she would marry it to the new Renaissance arts of loveliness and culture, and in that marriage of the old and the new lay the secret of her extraordinary rise. First, though, she had to be born into her family and her name, and it is to her birth and her lineage that we turn now. Diane de Poitiers was born in the year 1500 into one of the old and honourable noble houses of France, a family that could trace its line back through long centuries of service to the crown. Her father was Jean de Poitiers, Seigneur de Saint-Vallier, a nobleman of the Dauphine in the southeast of the kingdom, and her mother came of good lineage as well, so that the child was born to a name and a rank that placed her among the established aristocracy of France. There was nothing humble about her origins, nothing of the gutter or the shop or the obscure cottage. She was a daughter of the warrior nobility, raised from her cradle to understand that she belonged to the families who had served and counselled and fought for the kings of France since the days of chivalry. The exact circumstances of her early childhood are not richly documented, as is so often the way with the youth even of the famous in that distant age, but the broad shape of her upbringing is clear enough. She was raised as a noblewoman of the new Renaissance fashion, given an education that went beyond the old expectation that a girl should merely be pious and obedient and skilled with a needle. She learned to read and write with ease. She was taught something of the classical learning that the era admired, and she was trained in all the accomplishments that a lady of the Valois court would need, in music and dancing and conversation, in riding and the management of a household, in the graces and the manners of polite society. Above all, she was raised to carry herself with the dignity and the assurance of her rank. It was a hard and a healthy upbringing in many ways, for the nobility of that age did not coddle their children, and Diane grew into a girl of remarkable physical vigour and discipline. She rode superbly and loved the hunt, that leading passion of the French nobility, and she kept all her life the habits of an active, open-air existence that would help to preserve her famous health, and looks far into an age when most of her contemporaries had grown old and stout and worn. There was in her, from the beginning, a strain of cool self-command, a discipline of body and mind that set her apart from softer and more indulgent natures, and it was this discipline, as much as any gift of feature, that would one day make her seem ageless. She was given by the standards of the day an excellent education, for the new humanist learning held that a lady of rank should be cultivated as well as virtuous, and Diane was schooled in reading and writing and the management of affairs, in music and the arts and the bearing of the court, and above all in the physical disciplines of riding and hunting that she would carry to such lengths in later life. From her earliest period there was remarked in her a steadiness, a composure, a cool good sense beyond her age, the first signs of the iron self-command that would carry her so far. She was being shaped in the manners of her family into the formidable woman she would become. So she came into the world a daughter of the old France, the France of lineage and honour and the warrior code, and she carried that proud inheritance into the new world of the Renaissance court. She would always be, beneath all her later splendour, a vast noblewoman of the old school, conscious of her blood and her name, governed by a strict sense of dignity and propriety that never deserted her even at the height of her power. This was the foundation of everything she became. But her childhood was not to be untroubled, for while she was still young her family was caught up in one of the great dramas of the reign, a brush with treason and the scaffold that came within a breath of destroying them all, and that taught the young Diane a lesson about the perilous favour of kings that she would never forget. It is to that dark episode that we turn next. The drama that fell upon Diane's family had its roots in the powerful quarrel between King Francis I and the most powerful nobleman in France, the Constable of Bourbon, a prince of the blood who commanded vast lands and fine armies, and who, feeling himself wronged and slighted by the king, turned at last to treason. In the year 1523, the constable conspired with the king's enemies, with the Emperor Charles V and the King of England, in a plot to betray France and carve up the kingdom, and when the plot was discovered, he fled the country and took up arms against his own sovereign. It was the gravest treason of the years of rule, and the king's vengeance fell hard upon all who were thought to have shared in it. Among those drawn into the affair was Diane's father, Jean de Poitiers, who was accused of having known of the constable's treason and failed to reveal it. Whether he was truly guilty, or merely caught in the wide net that the king's anger cast, has never been entirely clear, but he was arrested, tried, and condemned to death, and the sentence was that he should be beheaded. For Diane, by then a young married woman, it was a catastrophe of the most personal and terrible kind. The threatened destruction of her father and the ruin of her family's honour, and tradition holds that she pleaded for his life, throwing herself upon the mercy of the king. The story that she won his pardon through her own beauty and persuasion is probably a later embellishment, but the family did indeed strain every nerve to save him. The most dramatic moment came on the day appointed for the execution itself, when Diane de Poitiers was brought out to the scaffold, prepared for end, only to be halted at the last possible instant by the arrival of a reprieve. The king, whether moved by the pleading of the family or by his own second thoughts, commuted the sentence, and the condemned man was led away from the very edge of death to a prison cell instead, and in time he was released altogether and restored to a measure of favour. It was a deliverance as sudden and as total as the condemnation had been, a swing from the certainty of death to the gift of life in a single moment, and it left its mark upon all who lived through it. Her father, Jean de Poitiers, was caught up in the conspiracy of the Constable de Bourbon, the great nobleman who turned traitor against Francis I, and for his part in it he was condemned to death. He was brought out to the scaffold, so the story goes, and made ready for the axe, and only at the last possible moment, with his head upon the block, was the reprieve announced that spared his life and commuted his sentence. Whether the drama was quite so extreme as the legend made it, the essential fact is certain, that Diane's father came within a breath of execution for treason, and that the household was plunged into terror and disgrace before the king's mercy lifted the shadow. It was a lesson in the perilous favour of kings that the youthful she is unlikely ever to have forgotten. For the young Diane, this terrible episode was a lesson written in the starkest possible terms, a lesson about the nature of the world she lived in and the perilous, absolute power of kings. She had seen how the favour of the crown could raise a family to honour, and how its anger could cast that same family down to the scaffold. In a moment, how everything depended upon the will of one man, and how a life might hang upon a word or a glance from the sovereign. It was a lesson that surely shaped the cool, careful, calculating temperament that marked her all her days, the watchfulness and the discipline and the refusal ever to take her position for granted. She had learned young and hard that nothing at court was ever truly safe, and she would build her whole later life upon the knowledge. But before that rise began, she had first to be married, and it is to her marriage, to a man old enough to be her grandfather, that we turn next. When Diane was not yet 16, in 1515 she was married, as noble women of her rank were married, by the arrangement of her family and for the advancement of her house. Her husband was Louis de Brézé, the Grand Seneschal of Normandy, one of the great officers of the crown and a man of high birth and vast estates, a grandson, through an illegitimate line, of an earlier king of France. He was a powerful and a wealthy nobleman, established at the very heart of the country's affairs, and the match raised Diane at a stroke to a position of real consequence, making her the wife of one of the foremost men of Normandy and the mistress of broad lands and noble houses. There was, however, one striking feature of the marriage, and it was the very feature that the modern mind seizes upon at once, for Louis de Brézé was old enough to be Diane's grandfather. He was a man of some 56 when he married his bride of 15, more than 40 years her senior, his face by then deeply lined, and by the report of those who saw him, far from handsome. It was an extraordinary disparity of age, and yet by the standards of the time it was nothing remarkable at all, for amid the high nobility marriage was a matter of property and alliance and lineage, not of romantic inclination, and a young girl might very well be given to a much older man if the match served the interests of both families. Diane, raised in the strict code of her class, accepted her destiny without complaint, and set herself to be a good bride. And a good wife she was by every account that survives. Whatever the gulf of years between them, the Duchess gave her elderly husband loyalty, respect, and a dutiful affection, and she bore him 2 daughters, and she managed his grand household and his estates with the competence and the dignity that marked everything she did. There is no whisper of scandal attached to her name in these years, no hint that the young wife chafed against her aged husband or sought consolation elsewhere. On the contrary, she seems to have honoured him sincerely, and when he died she mourned him with a depth and a constancy that went far beyond the requirements of mere form. Theirs was not a marriage of passion, but it was a marriage of genuine respect, and it gave Diane her first powerful schooling in the management of authority and property. The marriage lasted some 16 years, until Louis de Brézé died in 1531, and throughout it Diane conducted herself in a manner that won universal approval. She was the perfect wife of a great officer of the crown, dignified and capable, and beyond reproach, and the experience taught her lessons she would never forget, in the handling of property and people, in the bearing proper to a great lady, and in the patient art of making the best of whatever fortune sent her. When her husband died, she put on the black and white of mourning, and she would wear those colours in his memory for the rest of her life. For it was as the bride of the Grand Seneschal that the favourite first learned the practical arts that would serve her so well in her later greatness, the administration of vast estates, the handling of money and law and dependence, the conduct of a leading mansion hold, the navigation of the palace and its endless intrigues. She proved herself in this period a woman of formidable capability, shrewd and careful and exact, with a head for business and a grasp of affairs that few women of her age possessed. The cultivated grace she had been raised to was now joined to a hard practical competence, and the combination was rare and powerful. She was learning, in short, to be a ruler of her own small world, and when the chance came to rule a far larger one, she would be ready. But first her husband would die, and his passing would set her upon the path that defined her, the path of the famous widow in her dark and pale colours. To that widowhood we turn next. In the time of her marriage, Diane was not merely the mistress of a country household, but a figure at the royal court itself, for her husband's high office and her own birth gave her a place in the dazzling world of Francis I. As Madame la Sénéchale, the wife of the Grand Seneschal of Normandy, she moved among the highest in the land, attending upon the Queen and the royal ladies, taking her part in the festivals and the ceremonies and the endless social theatre of the Valois court. It was here, in these years, that she perfected the arts of the courtier, the grace and the discretion and the watchful intelligence that the life of the Valois court demanded. And it was here that she first came to be noticed, a tall and striking young lady of cool composure and faultless manners. She was, by the testimony of those who knew her, already a creature of remarkable presence. She was tall for the age, with a fine carriage and a clear, fresh complexion, fair-haired and grey-eyed, and she dressed and bore herself with a restraint and an elegance that set her apart from the gaudier beauties of the palace. There was nothing flashy or coquettish about her. Her appeal lay rather in her dignity, her composure, her air of cool self-possession, and in the disciplined health that gave her skin its clarity and her movements their ease. Men admired her, and women studied her, and she began to acquire the reputation for a loveliness out of the common run that would follow her all her life. Yet she was no idle ornament of the court, for behind the elegant surface worked a mind of unusual shrewdness and a will of unusual strength. She managed her husband's affairs with skill, she understood money and land and law, and she kept herself informed of the vast matters of the Valois court and the kingdom, watching and weighing and learning the ways of influence. The lesson of her father's brush with the scaffold was never far from her thoughts, and it had made her careful, observant, and self-controlled, a woman who gave little away and missed nothing. While other young noblewomen lived for pleasure and display, the Duchess was, beneath her elegance, always at work, always learning, always preparing, though for what she could not yet have said. Her seasons as Madame la Sénéchale were time of real responsibility, for the Grand Sénéchal held great offices and vast estates in Normandy, and much of their management fell to his capable young wife, who proved herself a shrewd and diligent administrator of a powerful inheritance. She bore her husband 2 daughters, Françoise and Louise, and she saw to their upbringing and their education with the same care she gave to all her affairs, and in time she would make fine marriages for them, binding her blood into the high nobility of France. At the court of Francis I, that most brilliant and pleasure-loving of courts, she moved with a grace and a reserve that set her apart, neither retiring into obscurity, nor throwing herself into the gallantry and intrigue that swirled about her, but holding a place of quiet distinction, admired for her bearing and her loveliness and her good sense. She bore her husband 2 daughters in these decades, and she was a careful and devoted mother, raising them with the same discipline and the same eye to advancement that governed all her conduct. Her household was a model of good order, her estates were well managed, her conduct was beyond reproach. She had made herself, by her early 30s, into a model of what a noble woman of rank should be, accomplished and dignified and capable, respected by all, and scandalized by none. And then, in the year 1531, her husband died, and Diane, still in the prime of her life, became a widow. The manner in which she chose to meet that widowhood would define her forever, and it is to that famous choice that we turn next. Louis de Brézé died in the summer of 1531, full of years, leaving his wife of 31 a widow with 2 young daughters and a vast inheritance to defend. The death of an aged husband, protracted expected, might have been met by a younger wife with private relief and a decent show of mourning, soon laid aside for the pleasures of a fresh and unencumbered life. Diane did nothing of the kind. She mourned her husband with a depth and a public constancy that astonished the court, and she made of that mourning the foundation of a personal legend that would carry her to the heights of the realm. She commissioned for him a magnificent tomb, a masterpiece of the new Renaissance sculpture, in the Cathedral of Rouen, and she had herself represented upon it, kneeling in eternal grief beside the recumbent figure of her lord. And she made a decision about herself that would mark her for the rest of her days, for she resolved that she would wear from that time forward only the livery of mourning, only the severe livery, and she kept that resolution with an iron consistency for the 35 period of life that remained to her. Black and white became her signature, her emblem, the colours by which all France would know her, and she wove them into everything, into her gowns and her hangings and her liveries, until they seemed less the marks of grief than the badge of a personal cult. There was in this something more than simple sorrow, for Diane was far too shrewd a woman not to understand the influence of self-presentation, and her perpetual mourning was, among other things, a stroke of genius in the art of distinction. In a court of brilliant and competing colours, of crimson and gold and peacock blue, the tall figure, always in austere her colours, stood out as nothing else could, a study in elegant restraint that drew every eye precisely by refusing to compete. The mourning that should have signalled withdrawal from society became, in her hands, the most striking entrance into it, a way of being noticed by seeming to renounce notice, and it suited to perfection her cool, disciplined classical style. She had turned grief into glamour. The choice of black and white was, in its origin, the choice of mourning. These were the scheme of grief in that age, and a widow was expected to wear them through the period of her bereavement. But the favourite did not lay them aside when the period of mourning ended, as other widows did, returning to the bright colours of the court. She kept them, year after year, for the whole of the rest of her life, making of the mourning of her widowhood a permanent livery, a personal uniform of her dark and pale livery that became in time inseparable from her image. It was a stroke of genius, this self-denial of colour, for amid the gaudy plumage of the court, the lady in the severe livery stood out as something austere and elegant and apart, and the very severity of it set off her looks as no finery could have done. And there was a further dimension to it, deeper still, for her colours of mourning came to blend, in her personal symbolism, with the silver and the crescent moon of the goddess, her namesake, the chaste huntress of the ancient myths. The colours of the widow and the colours of the moon goddess were the same cool, pale, austere scheme, and Diane fused the two, the mourning wife and the virgin goddess, into a single dazzling image of disciplined and untouchable grace. It was a feat of self-creation, as remarkable as anything in the age, the deliberate fashioning of a living legend out of the raw material of her own grief and her own name. The widow in black and white was not merely mourning a husband. She was inventing Diane de Poitiers, and the central pillar of that invention was the thing for which she became most famous of all, her face, and the strange way it seemed to defy the passing of the decades. It is to that beauty that we turn next. Of all the things for which she became famous, none was so celebrated, so wondered at, and so envied as her beauty, and above all the strange and seemingly miraculous way it endured. For this was a woman who held the heart of a king through her 40s and her 50s, and even into her 60s, who was admired and desired and held up as the loveliest woman at court at an age when her contemporaries had long since faded into stout and wrinkled matrons. It seemed to defy the natural order of things, and the court whispered and marvelled and searched for an explanation, and the legend grew that Diane had discovered some secret, some magic or some elixir that held the time forever at bay. The truth, as far as it can be known, was less magical, but in its way more impressive, for the Duchess's enduring beauty was the fruit of a discipline so severe and so unremitting that few could have sustained it. She rose every day with the dawn, long before the rest of the palace, and she began her mornings, summer and winter alike, with a cold bath plunging into water that the pampered ladies of the court would have found unthinkable. She rode for hours, she hunted, she kept her body hard and active with constant exercise when other great ladies lounged and grew soft, and she ate and drank with a moderation that was almost ascetic, where the court gorged and idled and aged. She lived like an athlete, and her body rewarded her for it. There were darker rumours, too, about how she preserved her looks, and modern science has even lent them a strange and grim support, for it has been suggested that she drank a preparation containing gold, a fashionable elixir of the age believed to confer health and long youth. If she did, it would have done her no good and a great deal of harm, for such a draught is in fact a slow poison, and the pale, almost luminous complexion that contemporaries so admired may have owed something to its toxic effects. But this is a matter of later speculation, and the plain fact remains that whatever she did, by discipline or by chance or by some draught of folly, the result was a loveliness that endured against all the expectations of the era. What lay behind it, the world could only guess, and guess it endlessly did, but those who knew her best understood that the secret was no secret at all, but only an iron and unwearying self-command. She had decided, it seems very early, that she would not submit to the common fate of women, that she would not let the years take from her the beauty that was the foundation of her power, and she bent her formidable will to the preserving of it with the same cold determination she brought to every other part of her life. It was discipline, not magic, that kept her young, the hardest and rarest magic of all. Yet to dwell only on the smoothness of her skin, or the slenderness of her figure, is to miss the deeper source of her appeal, for the loveliness that held a king for 30 years was not merely a matter of feature and complexion. It was a loveliness of bearing, of presence, of style, the beauty of a woman utterly in command of herself and of the impression she made, dignified and serene and faultlessly elegant, who carried into her 60s the assurance and the grace of one who had never for a moment doubted her own worth. She had made herself a work of art, composed and polished and perfected, and she presented that work to the world with a confidence that was itself a kind of allure. It was this, the whole commanding image, far more than any trick of the complexion, that enchanted the man who would love her for the whole of his life, and that man was, at the time of her widowhood, still a wounded and silent boy, the second son of the king, and it is to him that we turn next. The boy who would one day raise the favourite to the summit of France was, in the time of her widowhood, an unhappy and a wounded child, the second son of King Francis I, born in the 1519 and named Henri. As a second son he was not at first expected to inherit the throne, for he had an elder brother, the Dauphin Francis, who stood before him in the line of succession, and Henri grew up in the shadow of that brighter and more favoured boy. But it was not his place in the family that marked him most deeply. It was a catastrophe that fell upon him when he was 7 years old, an ordeal of fear and abandonment that scarred his whole nature and made him the grave, silent, melancholy man he became. The catastrophe had its origin in one of the disasters of his father's, the years of his rule. In the year 1525, King Francis was defeated and captured by the forces of the Emperor Charles V at the Battle of Pavia in Italy and carried off a prisoner to Spain. To win his own release, the king was forced to agree to a humiliating treaty, and as a guarantee that he would keep its terms, he was required to hand over his 2 elder sons to the emperor as hostages in his place. So it was that little Henri, a boy of 7, together with his elder brother, was taken from his home and his country and delivered into the hands of his father's enemies, to be held captive in Spain, far from everything he knew, with no certainty of when or whether he would ever return. The captivity was long and harsh and frightening, and it left wounds upon Henri that never fully healed. The 2 royal offspring were held for some 4 decades, and as relations between France and the emperor soured, their treatment grew harsher rather than kinder, until the boys were confined in grim conditions, isolated, their French attendants taken from them, surrounded by foreign faces and a foreign tongue. For a sensitive child it was an ordeal of loneliness and fear and abandonment, made worse by the knowledge, however unjust, that he was suffering for his father's defeat, a small boy paying the price of a king's disaster. He emerged from it, at last, a changed and a darkened soul, grave and withdrawn and slow to trust, a boy who had learned that society was a cold and dangerous place, and that those one loved could not always protect one. The wound that shaped him had been dealt in his childhood, when he and his elder brother were sent into Spain as hostages for their captured father, given up to the Emperor Charles V as the price of the king's freedom after the disaster of Pavia. For some 4 seasons the boys were held in Spanish hands, much of the time in conditions of real hardship, isolated and homesick and afraid, children in the keeping of their father's enemy, and the experience marked Henri for life, drawing him into himself, making of him a grave and silent and melancholy boy. He came home from his captivity, a wounded and a wary child, ill at ease in the brilliant pleasure-loving court of his father, starved of affection and steadiness, carrying within him a deep need that Diane, when she came into his life, would answer as no one else could. This was the boy, melancholy and silent and starved of tenderness, who would grow into the king that Diane de Poitiers loved and ruled. The captivity had left him hungry for the security and the steady affection that his childhood had so cruelly denied him, and it had made him the kind of man who, once he gave his heart, would give it wholly and forever, clinging with a deep and stubborn constancy to the one fixed point in his uncertain world. He needed, above all, someone older and stronger and surer than himself, someone calm and constant who would never abandon him, and into that need, at exactly the right moment, stepped the composed and dignified figure of the widow in her dark and pale colours. The bond between them began, as it happened, on the very day the boy was carried off to his captivity, and it is to that first meeting that we turn next. The first thread of the bond between Diane de Poitiers and the boy who would be king was spun, according to the tradition, on the day of his departure into captivity, when the little princes were taken to the Spanish border to be handed over as hostages. It was a day of grief and ceremony, and the court ladies attended upon the frightened children to comfort them and bid them farewell, and among those ladies was Diane. The story holds that as the 7-year-old Henri prepared to be delivered to his father's enemies, the Duchess stepped forward and embraced him or kissed him upon the brow in blessing, a gesture of tenderness toward a terrified child at the worst moment of his young life. Whether the tale is literally true in every detail, it captures something real, for in the boy's memory, Diane became associated, from his earliest years, with kindness and comfort at a time of fear. When Henry returned at last from his long captivity, a changed and a wounded boy, she was there in his world, a creature of his mother's generation, calm and dignified and kind, and the bond that had been planted in his childhood began to grow. She was given in time a formal place in his life, appointed to roles about the young prince that brought her into regular contact with him, and she treated him with the steady, maternal, encouraging attention that his starved nature craved. She drew him out, she gave him confidence, she became for him the embodiment of everything he most needed, a strong and constant presence who would not abandon him, and the grave boy attached himself to her with the deep and stubborn love that was the mark of his nature. For a protracted time the bond was that of an older woman and a young boy, a thing of guidance and encouragement and maternal care, and there was nothing in it, in those early seasons, of the passion it would later become. The favourite was nearly 20 years Henri's senior, old enough to be his mother, a lady of high rank and a respectable widow, and she stood to him at first in something like the place of a second mother or a beloved elder kinswoman. But attachment of that kind, planted deep in the heart of a lonely and intense young man, has a way of changing its nature as the boy becomes a youth and the youth becomes a man, and the maternal attachment of the wounded child slowly deepened over the years into something far more powerful and far more lasting. Whatever its precise beginning, the bond once formed never loosened, and that is the truly remarkable thing about it. Many a boy has felt a passing tenderness for an older woman who showed him kindness, and many such feelings fade with the coming of manhood and the arrival of younger loves. But Henry's feeling for Diane did not fade. It deepened and fixed itself and became the central attachment of his life, outlasting his boyhood, his marriage, and his accession to the throne. There was in him some constancy of nature, some incapacity for change in matters of the heart, that bound him to the first object of his devotion with a tenacity that nothing could shake. By the years Henri grew to young manhood, the bond had become the central fact of his emotional life, an attachment so total and so fixed that it would govern him until the day he died. Whatever else changed in his world Whatever duties or marriages or wars were laid upon him, the Duchess remained the constant, the fixed star, the one he turned to and trusted and adored above all others. It was a love that the modern mind finds strange, this lifelong passion of a king for a woman old enough to be his mother, but it grew out of the deepest wound of his childhood, the terror of abandonment, and Diane was the answer to that terror, the one who had been kind to him in his darkest hour, and who never, in all the time that followed, let him down. But before that passion could come to its full flower, Henry had first to be married, and married not to Diane but to another, and it is to that royal marriage that we turn next. In the year 1533, when Henri was 14 years old, he was married as princes were married for reasons of state to a foreign bride chosen to serve the interests of the crown. His bride was Catherine de Medici, a girl of the same age as himself, the daughter of the vast banking family of Florence that had risen to rule that city and to furnish the church with popes. It was, on the face of it, a startling match for a son of France, for the Medici were not royalty but merchants, however rich and powerful, and the French nobility looked down upon the Florentine bride as a tradesman's daughter raised above her station. But the match brought with it the alliance of the reigning Pope, Catherine's kinsman, and the promise of a grand dowry and useful friends in Italy, and so the marriage was made. Catherine de Medici came to France a plain and frightened girl, far from home, married into a proud and foreign court that regarded her with thinly veiled contempt, joined to a husband who felt no love for her and whose heart was already given elsewhere. She was not beautiful. She spoke throughout the period of his rule accent. She was surrounded by people who thought her beneath them, and she had to make her way by patience and watchfulness and sheer endurance in a world that had no welcome for her. It was a hard apprenticeship, and it shaped her as the captivity in Spain had shaped Henri, teaching her to wait, to dissemble, to bide her time and conceal her thoughts, lessons that she would one day put to formidable use. But all that lay far in the future. For now she was simply the unloved wife, watching while her husband's devotion flowed toward another. When at length he married, the wedding altered none of this, for the match with the Florentine bride was an affair of policy, in which his own wishes had no part, and he gave to it only the outward duty that his rank required. The deep places of his heart were already filled, and so they remained, and the young queen found herself from the very first sharing her husband with a presence she could not dislodge. She was not, in those early days, a figure to inspire much respect at the haughty French court, for she came of a family that, however rich, was reckoned merely mercantile by the old nobility of France, the descendants of a line of Florentine moneylenders who had bought their way to greatness. She was plain, too, where Diane was beautiful, and young and uncertain where Diane was poised, and for many years she counted for very little, valued only for the alliance she represented, and watched with a faint condescension by the courtiers among whom she moved. So was set, in this early period, the strange triangle that would govern the French court for a generation, the king-to-be, the wife he did not love, and the older woman he adored. It was a triangle of extraordinary tension, and yet it held together, year after year, with a stability that surprised everyone, for each of the three played a part and kept to it. Henri gave his public duty and his offspring to Catherine and his private heart to the favourite. Catherine swallowed her humiliation and waited, and Diane, with consummate skill, managed the whole delicate arrangement, ruling the king's affections while never quite tipping into the open scandal that might have brought the queen's faction down upon her. How she came to hold that attachment so completely, and what it grew into as Henri became a man, is the next thread of our story. As Henri passed from boyhood into young manhood, the maternal bond that had tied him to Diane since his childhood ripened into something altogether more powerful, a romantic and passionate devotion that became the ruling force of his emotional life. The exact moment when the attachment changed its nature cannot be fixed, for it was a gradual deepening rather than a sudden event. But by the time Henry was in his late teens, it was plain to all the court that the prince was in love, deeply and helplessly in love, with the widow nearly 20 years his senior. It was a passion that would never cool, never waver, and never be displaced, that would hold him fast until the day he died, and it astonished and scandalized and fascinated the court in equal measure. To the modern mind, and indeed to many minds of his own day, there was something strange and even unnatural in this devotion of a young prince to a woman old enough to be his mother, and the puzzle of it has occupied historians and gossips alike for 5 centuries. But the roots of it are not, in truth, so very mysterious, for they lie in the deep wound of Henri's childhood, in the terror and abandonment of his captivity, and in the hunger for security and constant love that those seasons had left in him. Diane was the answer to that hunger, the calm and dignified and unwavering presence, who had been kind to him in his darkest hour, and who never failed him afterward. And to a nature like his, marked by that early trauma, such a figure was worth more than any young beauty. He did not want a girl to dazzle him. He wanted a rock to cling to, and Diane was that rock. And Diane, for her part, met his attachment with a skill and a self-command that were the marks of her whole character. She did not, by all the evidence, lose her head or her heart in the manner of a girl swept off her feet, for she was far too disciplined and too shrewd for that. And there was always, in her management of the prince's passion, a strong element of calculation. She understood exactly what she had, the total and lifelong devotion of the heir to the throne of France, and she set herself to keep it and to use it, binding Henri to her with a careful blend of affection and reserve, of encouragement and dignity, that gave him the security he craved while never letting the relationship slip from her control. She was the mistress of his heart in every sense, the one who governed and directed and shaped a passion that she never allowed to govern her. The strangeness of it was not lost upon the court, for she was some 20 years older than the prince who adored her, old enough to be his mother, a widow of mature age, when he was still a youth, and yet his love for her never wavered through all the days of his life. What the court found hardest to credit was the constancy of it, for the world expected such an infatuation to burn itself out, and instead it only deepened with the years, surviving every change in Henri's circumstances and every rival who might have supplanted her. The boy who had been starved of love had found in Diane the one fixed point of his life, and he held to her with the tenacity of a need that went down to the roots of his being. Whether there was in Diane any answering passion of her own, any depth of feeling for the younger man beyond the cool satisfaction of her ambition, is a question that the sources do not finally answer, for she kept her own heart as carefully guarded as she kept everything else. It is likely enough that genuine affection grew in her over the long years of their bond, for she could hardly have failed to be moved by a devotion so complete and so faithful, and she served his interests all his life with a loyalty that suggests something more than mere calculation. But whatever the precise temperature of her own feelings, she gave Henry what he needed, and he gave her in return the most spectacular position a French woman of that age could hold. As that position grew, Diane fashioned around it a dazzling personal myth, drawn from her own name and the legends of the ancient world, and it is to that myth, the cult of Diana, the huntress of the chase, that we turn next. One of the most remarkable things about the favourite, and one of the keys to her hold upon the imagination of her generation and of all the eras since, was the brilliant personal myth that she fashioned around herself, drawing upon her own name and the rich storehouse of classical legend that the Renaissance so adored. Her name, Diane, was the French form of Diana, the name of the great goddess of the ancient Romans, the virgin huntress of the moon, chaste and cold and beautiful, who roamed the forests with her bow and her hounds and suffered no man to touch her. The educated court of the Valois, steeped in the rediscovered learning of antiquity, delighted in such mythological correspondences, and Diane seized upon it and made of it the central image of her self-presentation. She fashioned herself, quite deliberately, into a living embodiment of the chaste deity whose name she bore. The crescent moon, the emblem of Diana, appeared everywhere about her, carved into her residences, and worked into her ornaments and stamped upon her possessions. The livery she had adopted in her widowhood, the austere, the severe livery, blended seamlessly with the silver paleness of the moon deity, so that her mourning and her myth reinforced one another in a single cool and luminous figure. She was painted again and again as the moon deity, as the huntress with her bow, as the deity of the moon, slender and pale and serene, and the artists of the age, the finest in France, lent their skill to the fashioning of the legend. The most famous images of the French Renaissance are images of the Duchess de Poitiers in the guise of the deity, and through them her cult was spread across the kingdom and down the centuries. There was a deep cleverness in the choice, for Diana was above all chaste, the virgin who belonged to no man, and by wrapping herself in that legend, Diane lent to her position a dignity and a purity that it might otherwise have lacked. She was, after all, the mistress of a married king, a role that the strict and the pious might condemn, and the myth of the chaste myth threw over that delicate situation a veil of classical nobility, transforming the king's mistress into something loftier and cleaner, a figure served by a devoted knight rather than a wife, betrayed by a wandering husband. The cult of the Moon Lady made her passion respectable, even noble, casting Henri in the role of the worshipful hero, and she in the role of the cold and worthy goddess he adored from below. Paul Salut. The cult of the huntress suited her in every particular, for the goddess was associated with the chase, and Diane loved the chase above all sports. Diana was the moon, cool and silver and remote, and Diane cultivated a cool and silvery elegance. The goddess was chaste and self-possessed, and the favourite wrapped herself in an air of virtue and reserve that set her above the common run of mistresses. She took the crescent for her emblem, the black and white for her colours, the figure of the huntress for her image, and she built the whole presentation of herself around the ancient myth, until the woman and the Diana were one in the imagination of the court. It was a sustained and brilliant piece of self-creation, carried through with consummate art, and it lifted her above the ordinary fate of favourites into a kind of legend. And the hunt itself, the great passion of Diana and of the French nobility alike, was woven into the image, for Diane was a famous and tireless huntswoman, riding to hounds with a vigour that few could match, and the picture of the Areless looks galloping through the forests at the head of the chase was one that perfectly fused Diane and the myth. She had taken her own name, her own grief, her own affection of the hunt, and her own disciplined and untouchable style, and she had fused them all into a single, dazzling, unforgettable image, the moon goddess of the Valois court, ageless and cool and supreme. It was one of the leading feats of self-creation in the history of European courts, and it carried her, as Henri rose toward the throne, to a position of power unlike any a royal mistress had held before. To that rise to authority we turn next, for many times while old King Francis I still reigned, Diane's position, though brilliant, was not yet supreme, for Henry was only the second son, and then, after the early end of his elder brother, the Dauphin and heir, but not yet the king. The court of Francis I had its own reigning beauty, the king's own mistress, and a measure of rivalry and tension ran between the old king's circle and the rising circle of the Dauphin and his adored Diane. Francis, it was said, looked with no vast favour upon his son's attachment to the older woman, and there were frictions and slights between the two factions. But the favourite bided her time with her usual patience, secure in the unwavering love of the heir, knowing that the day would come when Henry sat upon the throne and she with him at the height of the kingdom. That day came in the spring of 1547, when old King Francis died at last and Henry, at the age of 28, became King Henri II of France. And with his accession, the position of Diane de Poitiers was transformed overnight from that of the favourite of an heir into that of the most powerful person in the realm after the king himself. All the time of patience and discipline and careful management came to their reward. For Henry, now master of France, lavished upon the woman he loved a position, a wealth, and an authority that no royal mistress of France had ever before enjoyed. She stood, suddenly, at the very summit, the uncrowned queen of the new reign, and the entire court turned toward her as toward the rising sun. The signs of her ascendancy were immediate and unmistakable. Henri showered her with gifts of lands and money and titles. He gave her precedence and honour that approached and sometimes exceeded that of the queen herself, and he made plain to the entire court, in 100 public ways, that Diane was the first lady of his heart and his reign. He took for his own the emblems and the colours associated with her, the entwined initials and the crescent moon, and he stamped them upon his palaces and his possessions, an extraordinary public declaration of a private love. The new king did not hide his love or treat it as a thing of shame, but displayed it openly, proudly, as the central fact of his life, and the court and the kingdom adjusted themselves to the reality that France had, in effect, two queens, the one who wore the crown and the one who held the king's heart. Ah, her elevation when it came was swift and complete, for the new king lost no time in showing the world where his heart lay, and that the honours and the wealth and the substance of power flowed to her in a flood from the first days of the reign. She who had waited so long in the wings stepped at once to the very centre of the stage, and the court, reading the signs, hastened to pay its court to the woman who now held the king and through him the kingdom. It was a position without true precedent, and she filled it with a mastery that confirmed her fitness for it. She did not behave as a giddy favourite drunk on sudden fortune, but as what she was, a noble woman of rank of mature years and formidable ability, who took up the reins of influence with the same cool competence she had always shown. She involved herself in the business of the kingdom, in appointments and policy and finance. She dispensed patronage and managed factions. She built and collected and presided, and she did it all with a dignity and a control that commanded respect even from those who resented her. The widow in her dark and pale colours had become the ruling spirit of the most cultured court in Europe, and the symbol of that rule, displayed across the whole of France, were the pair of entwined initials that proclaimed her bond with the king. It is to that bold and very public symbol that we turn next, among the most extraordinary expressions of Henri's devotion to her, and one that still astonishes the visitor to the chateau of the Loire today, was the bold and very public display of their bond through a personal emblem stamped across the royal palaces of France. The emblem was a pair of initials entwined, the H of Henri and the D of her, twined together so closely and so artfully that the two letters became a single design, inseparable, each embracing the other. This device the king had carved into the stone of his palaces, worked into their ceilings and their fireplaces and their doorways, set above their entrances and woven into their tapestries, so that wherever the court moved, the entwined initials of the king and his mistress proclaimed their union to all the age. There was a particular boldness in this, for the emblem proclaimed not the king's marriage, but his love affair, displaying upon the very fabric of the royal residences the bond between the sovereign and a woman who was not his wife. By the cool arithmetic of heraldry, the H and the D entwined ought to have been the initials of the King and the Queen, of Henry and Catherine, and the placing of Diane's initial where the Queen's should have stood was a public statement of the most pointed kind. It announced to every courtier and every ambassador and every visitor that Diane and not Catherine was the true companion of the king's heart, and that he cared nothing for hiding it. Few royal mistresses in any age have been so openly, so permanently, so architecturally enshrined. Cleverer observers noted, too, that the design lent itself to a second reading, for the entwined initials with their curves and crossings could be made to resemble the crescent moon as well, the emblem of the deity Diana, so that the cipher of the lovers and the symbol of the moon deity merged into one. Whether this double meaning was intended from the first or discovered afterward, it suited Diane's whole genius for self-presentation perfectly, fusing once again the private bond and the classical myth into a single elegant image. The very letters of her name and the king's became in this device a part of the powerful legend of the moon goddess that she had fashioned around herself, stamped in stone across the realm. What made the device so striking was not merely its frequency, but its boldness, for it was set up in the most public and permanent places, cut into the fabric of the royal palaces themselves, where it would endure for centuries as a standing proclamation of the king's attachment. At Fontainebleau and at the Louvre, at Chambord and at Anet and at Chenonceau, the same device appeared, the H and the two interlaced crescents that could be read as DS, a public monogram of a private love, still displayed with a boldness that astonished even that frank and worldly age. It was a thing without precedent, this open heraldry of the heart, and it proclaimed, to everyone who passed beneath it, the strange completeness of the king's love. To walk today through the rooms of Chenonceau or Anet or the other palaces that Diane and Henry adorned is to see this emblem everywhere, the entwined letters gazing down from 100 ceilings and doorways, a silent witness to one of the most remarkable affection affairs in the history of monarchy. It was a declaration without precedent and almost without shame, the open and permanent enshrinement of a king's love for his mistress upon the very stones of his realm, and it tells us, more vividly than any document, how total and how unembarrassed that devotion was. Henri did not attachment Diane in secret. He proclaimed it to the centuries. And what that proclaimed devotion meant in the hard terms of sway and politics, the real authority that flowed to the Duchess from the king's heart, is the next thread of our story. To the substance of her influence we turn now. The position that the favourite held in the years of rule of Henri II was far more than the ornamental status of a favoured loveliness, for it carried with it a real and a formidable power over the affairs of the kingdom. She was, in everything but the title and the crown, a kind of second queen, and her influence reached into every corner of the court and the government. Those who sought the king's favour learned that the surest road to it ran through Diane, and the whole ambitious machinery of the court turned itself toward winning her goodwill, for a word from her could advance a career or block it, secure an office or deny it, and the fine and the lowly alike paid their court to the woman who held the king's heart. Her authority rested, in the first place, upon the simple and unshakable fact of Henri's love, for the king consulted her, trusted her, and deferred to her judgment in 100 matters great and small. He valued her counsel, which was shrewd and well-informed, and he leaned upon her steadiness, and he gave her, in effect, a standing share in the government of his realm. She was no mere bedfellow whose influence ended at the chamber door, but a working partner in power, consulted on appointments and policy, entrusted with patronage, drawn into the management of the kingdom's affairs. The cool, careful, capable woman who had once managed her husband's estates now managed, in large measure, the favour and the patronage of the crown of France. The forms of her influence were many. She placed her friends and allies and kinsmen in offices of profit and sway, building about herself a faction bound to her by interest and obligation. She involved herself in the weighty matters of state, in finance and diplomacy, and the management of the factions that divided the court. She received the appeals and the petitions of those who sought the king's grace, and she dispensed his favour as though it were partly her own to give. Ambassadors reported home that to deal with the court of France one must deal with Diane, and they treated her with the deference due to a power in her own right. She had become an institution, a fixed and central feature of the government of the kingdom, as much a part of its machinery as any minister. Her authority showed itself in 100 ways, in the appointments she could secure and the suits she could advance, in the access she controlled and the favours she dispensed, in the steady stream of petitioners who understood that the surest road to the king ran through his mistress. She did not hold office, for no office existed for what she was, and yet she wielded an authority greater than that of most who held the great offices of state, the authority of one who had the king's ear at every hour and his heart without reserve. Ambassadors reported her words to their masters, ministers consulted her wishes, the vast nobles courted her favour, and the whole vast machine of patronage and place that was the court turned, in grand part, upon the will of the woman in the severe livery. And she exercised this power, by all accounts, with skill and with a certain restraint, for she was too wise to overreach or to make herself needlessly hated. She used her influence to enrich and advance herself and her family, as everyone in her position did, but she did not, on the whole, abuse it recklessly or drive the country to ruin for her own ends. She was a competent and a careful steward of her own greatness, conscious always of the precariousness that underlay it, mindful of the lesson of her father's scaffold, never forgetting that all she had rested upon the life and the love of one man. She managed her sway as she managed everything, with discipline and calculation and a cool grasp of reality. Yet her greatness cast a lengthy and bitter shadow, and the one upon whom it fell most heavily was Diane, whose place she had usurped, the Queen herself, and it is to Catherine in the shadows that we turn next. While she de Poitiers reigned at the summit of the court, basking in the king's devotion and the deference of the kingdom, another woman watched from the shadows with a patience that concealed a depth of feeling few suspected. This was Catherine de Medici, the Queen, the wife whom Henri did not love, who was forced to endure, year after year, the spectacle of her husband's open adoration of another woman, and to yield precedence and honour and intimacy to the favourite who had supplanted her. It was a humiliation prolonged over decades, borne in public before the whole court of France, and Catherine bore it with an outward composure and a hidden resolve that would, in the end, make her one of the most formidable figures of the age. In the early decades her position was wretched indeed, for she was not only unloved but barren, unable for the first 10 period of her marriage to produce the heir that was the entire purpose of a royal wife. Her childlessness placed her in mortal danger, for a queen who could not bear children might be set aside, divorced, returned in disgrace to her own country, and there were those at court who urged exactly that course upon the king. That Catherine survived this peril she owed, by one of the strange ironies of the situation, in part to the favourite herself, for the favourite, calculating that a known and tolerable queen was safer than an unknown new one, is said to have used her influence to keep Henri loyal to his wife and to discourage talk of divorce. The favourite needed Catherine to remain queen, and so she protected her after a fashion even as she eclipsed her. When at last the offspring came, beginning in the year 1544, they came in abundance, for Catherine bore Henry 10 children over the following decades, securing the succession many times over and removing the threat to her position. And yet even motherhood did not give her the place she craved, for the king's heart remained with Diane, and there was a further bitterness in the arrangement, for the Duchess took a hand in the upbringing of the royal offspring, overseeing the nursery, supervising their care, so that the Queen had to share even her motherhood with the woman who had taken her husband. It was an extraordinary and a galling situation, the wife and mother subordinated, in her own household and over her own children, to the king's mistress. For many years Catherine bore no the young at all, and the failure hung over her like a sentence, for the whole purpose of a royal marriage was the getting of heirs, and a barren queen was a queen who had failed in her one essential duty. There was talk, in those anxious seasons, of setting her aside, of annulling the marriage and sending the Florentine home, and only the protection of the king, and curiously of Diane herself, who saw no advantage in a new and perhaps more dangerous queen, preserved her place. And then, after 10 seasons of barrenness, the children began to come, and came in abundance, until Catherine had borne 10 of them, and her position was secure at last. But the lengthy humiliation of those barren times was never forgotten, and it fed the patience and the watchfulness and the buried resentment that would one day have their hour. Through all these long years, Catherine kept her counsel and hid her resentment, presenting to the world a face of patient dignity, even of friendship toward her rival, for she understood that her hour had not yet come, and that to show her hand would be to lose. She watched, she waited, she endured, she learned, and she stored up in her heart the memory of every slight and every humiliation. Beneath the composed and accommodating surface, there grew a will of iron and a capacity for patient calculation that more than matched Diane's own, and the day would come, after Henry's death, when all that lengthy suppressed feeling would find its release, and the Queen who had waited so long would have her reckoning at last. But that day was far off, and for now Catherine remained in the shadows while the Duchess ruled in the light. The substance of that rule, Diane's real hand in the affairs of the realm, is the next thread we must follow. Diane de Poitiers was no mere decorative favourite, content to bask in the king's affection while leaving the business of government to others, for she took a real and an active hand in the affairs of the kingdom, and her influence shaped policy, appointments, and the influenceful rivalries that divided the court of France. She had a head for affairs that few women of her age were given the chance to develop, schooled in the management of estates and money and law during her years, as the wife of a great officer of the crown, and she brought that practical competence to bear upon the larger stage of the kingdom. Henri trusted her judgment and leaned upon her steadiness, and through him her hand was felt across the whole machinery of the state. Much of her influence ran through the great noble factions that competed for control of the king and his policies, for the court of Henry II was divided, as such courts always were, into rival parties striving for mastery. Diane allied herself, for much of the rule, with the powerful residents of the Constable de Montmorency, the leading soldier and minister, who was one of the dominant figures of the time, and the alliance between the favourite and the constable formed one of the central pillars of the government. Against them stood the rising house of Guise, the ambitious and brilliant family that would come to dominate France in the time after Henry's death, and the balance and the rivalry between these vast factions was one of the perpetual concerns of the decades of rule, with Diane at the centre of the web, weighing and managing and shifting her weight as her interest required. Her influence reached into the kingdom's finances as well, for the favour of the king brought with it access to the streams of money and patronage that flowed from the crown, and the favourite saw to it that those streams ran in generous measure, toward herself and her friends. She secured grants and pensions and lucrative offices. She involved herself in the leasing of crown lands and the gathering of revenues. She turned her position, with characteristic shrewdness, into a source of immense personal wealth. There was nothing unusual in this by the standards of the age, when the favour of the crown was understood to be a thing to be exploited for gain, and Diane exploited hers with a skill and a thoroughness that few could have matched. She grew over the years of her ascendancy into one of the richest people in France. She concerned herself with the finances of the crown, with appointments to office and to the church, with the management of the great affairs that came before the king, and her hand can be traced in much of the business of the reign. She favoured the interests of the Constable Montmorency, with whom she was protracted allied, and she had her dealings with the rising mansion of Guise, and she steered the flow of patronage with a careful eye to her own advantage and that of her connections. It was not that she ruled France, exactly, for the king ruled, and there were ministers and councils and all the apparatus of government, but she stood so near the king and held his confidence so completely that little of importance was done without her knowledge, and much was done at her wish. Yet for all her grasping after wealth and office, Diane was, in the conduct of affairs, a force for a certain stability and moderation, and her influence was not, on the entire, a reckless or a destructive one. She was too shrewd and too careful to drive the country into chaos for her own ends, and she used her authority much of the time to support able men and sound policies, to balance the factions rather than to inflame them, to keep the powerful machine of the state running smoothly for the benefit of the king, whose favour was the source of all she had. She was a conservative force, an upholder of order and orthodoxy, and in the troubled period of the decades of rule, with their wars abroad and their religious divisions at home, her steadying hand was not without its value. The rewards she drew from her position were vast, and it is to the scale of that wealth, the lands and the duchy and the riches that Henri lavished upon her, that we turn next. The wealth that Henri II poured upon. She was on a scale that befitted the position she held, the uncrowned queen of his rule, and it made her one of the richest and most landed women in all of France. From the moment of his accession, the king began to shower his beloved with gifts of lands and money and honours, and the flow continued, year after year, until Diane commanded an inheritance of estates and revenues that rivalled those of the greatest noble houses of the kingdom. The favour of the king was in that age the surest road to riches, and no one travelled that road more successfully than the favourite who held his heart. The crowning gift was a title, for in the year 1548 Henri raised she to the rank of Duchess of Valentinois, a duchy in the southeast of France, and so made her a fine territorial magnate in her own right, a peer of the realm with lands and vassals, and a place amid the highest nobility. To be made a duchess in herself, and not merely through a husband, was an extraordinary honour for a woman, a public elevation that set her formally among the greatest in the land, and it expressed, in the hard currency of land and title, the height to which the king's attachment had raised her. The widow of the Grand Seneschal had become a duchess, the equal in rank of princes, by the gift of the man who adored her. Beyond the duchy there flowed a steady stream of further bounty, of pensions and grants, and the profits of office, of crown lands placed in her hands and revenues diverted to her purse, until her wealth grew to truly formidable proportions. She received, among much else, a share in certain taxes and a portion of the fines and forfeitures that came to the crown, sources of income that swelled her fortune steadily, season upon season. She was a shrewd and an active manager of all this wealth, no passive recipient of bounty, but a careful businesswoman, who watched her estates and her revenues with an exacting eye, who lent money and pursued her debts and drove a hard bargain, and who multiplied what the king gave her by her own competent administration. The cool head for affairs that had served her as a young wife served her now on a far grander scale. Among the strangest sources of her wealth was the tax upon bells, a levy that Henri granted her at the start of his reign, the proceeds of a duty laid upon the church bells of France, so that it was said, with the sharp wit of the court, that the king had hung the bells of the realm about his mistress's neck. There were grants of confiscated property, the lands of those condemned for heresy or treason passing into her hands, that there were pensions and gifts and the profits of offices. There was the steady accumulation, season upon season, of the rewards that a devoted king could heap upon the woman he loved. And Diane gathered it all and managed it well, turning the stream of royal bounty into a solid and enduring fortune. And the wealth was not merely hoarded, but displayed and deployed, turned into the visible magnificence that proclaimed her greatness to society. She spent lavishly upon building and art and the adornment of her chateaux, upon the patronage of artists and craftsmen, upon the whole splendid apparatus of a great Renaissance establishment. Her riches became the foundation of her fame as a builder and a patron, the means by which she created the dazzling monuments that still bear her mark, and the greatest of these monuments rose upon two sites that the king's love placed in her hands. The first was a jewel of a chateau set upon a river in the heart of France, given to her by Anet as the supreme token of his devotion, and it is to that famous residence, Chenonceau, that we turn next. Of all the tokens of his devotion, none was more splendid than the gift of a house, and not merely a chateau but Chenonceau, the exquisite seat that sits upon the river, Cher in the valley of the Loire, one of the loveliest buildings in all of France. The king gave it to his beloved early in his rule, in the year 1547, as a token of his devotion, and Diane took possession of it with the delight of a woman receiving the jewel of her favour, and she set about making of it something more beautiful still. Chenonceau became, in the time of her ascendancy, the very emblem of her position, the dazzling country seat of the uncrowned Queen of France. The mansion that the Duchess received already stood upon its remarkable site, built across the end of a bridge that reached out over the slow green water of the Cher, but she was not content to leave it as it was, for she had the eye of a true patron and the means to indulge it. She laid out, beside the river, a magnificent garden, a great formal design of terraces and parterres and flower beds, protected from the floods of the river by raised embankments, a garden of geometric beauty in the new Italian fashion that was one of the wonders of the era, and she conceived a yet bolder scheme, to extend the mansion itself out across the Cher, to build a bridge from the chateau to the far bank of the Cher, so that the building should span the very water, a marriage of architecture and river that had no equal in France. The bridge was built to her design, reaching out across the Cher upon its arches, and it transformed Chenonceau from a house beside a river into a dwelling upon a river, a thing of unique and dreamlike beauty, its stones rising straight from the green water and reflected in it. It was a stroke of genius, this spanning of the river, and it gave the chateau the form that makes it, to this day, one of the most admired buildings in the world. Diane had taken a lovely residence and made it lovelier, had stamped upon it her own vision and her own taste, and Chenonceau became, in her hands, a monument to the union of Renaissance art and the French landscape, a perfect jewel set upon its river. Anet. She filled the residence with fine furniture and tapestries and works of art, and she laid out about it not only the vast formal garden by the water, but orchards and vineyards and walks, making of the whole estate a model of cultivated beauty. The accounts of her management survive in part, and they show a mistress attentive to every detail, to the planting and the building and the ordering of the household, a woman who took real and active pleasure in the improvement of her domain. Chenonceau under she was not merely a possession but a creation, the work of a cultivated and energetic mind, and it bore her stamp in every part. She loved the place dearly, and she spent there some of the happiest hours of her ascendancy, presiding over its gardens and its galleries, entertaining the king and the court amid its splendours, the moon goddess in her river palace. The entwined initials and the crescent moons were carved everywhere into its stone, proclaiming whose house it was, and the whole building breathed her presence and her myth. Yet there was a flaw at the heart of her possession of it, a flaw that would one day bring her grief, for Chenonceau was a property of the crown, given to her by the king, and what the king gave, a queen might one day take away. Catherine de Medici coveted Chenonceau with a deep and lasting desire, and the day would come when she would have it. But that lay in the future, and for now the river palace was Diane's, and she turned her energies next to a yet greater project, the building of a mansion entirely her own. To that chateau, the matchless Anet, we turn now. If Chenonceau was the king's gift to Diane, the chateau of Anet was Diane's gift to herself, the supreme expression of her wealth and her taste and her vision, the mansion that she conceived and built and adorned, to be the perfect setting for her own legend. Anet stood upon her own lands in the valley of the river Eure to the west of Paris, on the site of an older residence that had come to her through her marriage, and there, in the days of her greatness, she raised one of the masterpieces of the French Renaissance, a building so beautiful and so original that it set the standard for the architecture of the era. Into Anet she poured her fortune and her imagination, and from it she created a monument that proclaimed in stone and marble exactly who and what she was. To build it she employed the finest architect in France, a man of genius named Philibert Delorme, who was bringing to French architecture a new mastery of the classical principles rediscovered from antiquity, a new purity and harmony of proportion learned from the buildings of ancient Rome. Under his direction, and to Diane's exacting requirements, there rose at Anet a house of unprecedented elegance and sophistication, a building that married the grandeur of the classical orders to the comfort and the convenience of a grand modern residence. It had a magnificent frontispiece adorned with the classical columns, a domed and centrally planned chapel of remarkable looks, a powerful gateway crowned with sculpture, and throughout its courts and galleries a refinement of design that announced the arrival of the full Renaissance in France. Everywhere in the house the imagery of her selfful myth was woven into the fabric of the design, for Anet was not merely a beautiful building, but a temple to the goddess whose name its mistress bore. The crescent moons and the entwined initials adorned its stones. The image of the goddess appeared in its sculpture and its decoration, and the whole mansion was conceived as a setting for the Moon Lady of the Valois court. There was a famous sculpture of Diana reclining with a stag, a fountain crowned with her image. Decorations throughout that returned again and again to the themes of the hunt and the moon and the chaste and untouchable beauty that the favourite had made her emblem. To enter Anet was to enter the domain of the goddess, fashioned and furnished as the expression of a single dazzling personality. No. She entrusted the work to Philibert Delorme, the greatest French architect of the age, a master newly returned from Italy steeped in the principles of classical building, and between them they raised at Anet a dwelling that was a manifesto of the French Renaissance, a perfect marriage of Italian learning and French taste. There was a great gatehouse crowned with a bronze figure of the Moon Lady, a chapel of exquisite and original design, a courtyard of severe and beautiful proportion, gardens and fountains and galleries, the whole conceived as a single harmonious work, and executed with a refinement that set a new standard for France. Into every part of it, Diane wove her emblems, the crescents and the entwined initials, and the figure of Diana, so that the residence became a portrait of its mistress in stone and a temple to the figure she had made of herself. The chapel Anet, in particular, drew the admiration of all who saw it, a domed and centrally planned space of mathematical precision and serene beauty, one of the earliest and finest expressions in France of the new Italian manner. It was there, in the end, that she would choose to be laid to rest beneath the dome she had raised, and the choice was fitting, for the chapel gathered into one perfect space all the order and the harmony and the cool classical grace that had been the marks of her whole long life. The residence became famous throughout France and beyond as a marvel of the new architecture, a model that other builders studied and imitated, a landmark in the history of French art. It was the fullest and the most personal expression of Diane's greatness, the place where her wealth and her taste and her myth came together in a single perfect creation, and it remained the seat of her influence and the centre of her world for the entire of her ascendancy. In its design and its decoration she had set down, in the most enduring of all materials, the image she wished to leave to posterity, the cool and classical and untouchable deity of the moon, and the art with which she filled it, the sculpture and painting and craftsmanship that made Anet a treasure house of the Renaissance, is itself worth pausing upon, for the Duchess was amid the foremost patrons of her generation. To the art of Anet we turn next. Diane de Poitiers was one of the foremost patrons of art in the France of her day, and the mansions she built and adorned were treasure stores of the finest work that the Renaissance could produce, filled with sculpture and painting and craftsmanship of the highest order. She had the means, drawn from the king's bounty and her own shrewd management, to command the best artists in the kingdom, and she had the taste and the discernment to use them well, and the result was a body of patronage that placed her among the great makers and collectors of the age. Through her commissions she helped to shape the very style of the French New Classical, and the imagery she favoured, the cool classical themes of the moon and the hunt and the chaste goddess, spread outward from her mansions to influence the art of the whole kingdom. At the heart of her patronage stood the sculpture and decoration of Anet, where the finest artists of France lent their skill to the fashioning of her legend. There was the celebrated figure of the goddess reclining beside a stag, a masterpiece of Renaissance sculpture that crowned a fountain in the courts of the house, a likeness of cool and classical loveliness that became one of the famous works of the era. There were reliefs and statues and decorative carvings without number, all returning to the themes of the moon and the hunt and the disciplined loveliness of the deity, so that the entire residence was a gallery of images devoted to a single idea. The artists who served her were amid the best in the kingdom, masters of the new classical manner, and under her patronage they produced some of the defining works of French Renaissance art. She was painted too, again and again, by the leading portraitists of the day, who recorded her famous beauty and lent their skill to the spreading of her myth. She was depicted as herself, the cool and elegant leading lady in her black and white, and she was depicted as the goddess Diana, slender and pale and serene, the huntress of the moon. These representations, copied and circulated and admired throughout France, fixed her likeness and her legend in the mind of the time and carried them down the centuries, so that we may still gaze today upon the face that held a king for 3 decades, or upon the idealized huntress into whom she fashioned herself. Through the art she commissioned, Diane achieved a kind of immortality, her image preserved forever in marble and on canvas. If the architecture of Anet was the work of Philibert Delorme, its decoration drew upon the genius of the foremost artists of the French Renaissance, for Diane spared no expense in the adornment of her mansion and commanded the services of the best. The sculptor Jean Goujon, the greatest of the age, is associated with the carving that adorned it, and the famous reclining Diana that has come down to us, whether or not it is from his own hand, expresses the cool and classical ideal that the whole house embodied. There were painters and decorators and workers in bronze and stone, a whole company of craftsmen labouring under the direction of a mistress who knew exactly the effect she wished to achieve, and the result was an unity of conception rare in any age, a house in which every part spoke the same refined and classical language. Her patronage extended beyond the vast set pieces to the whole furnishing and adornment of her chateaux, to the tapestries and the panelling and the worked metal and the countless objects of loveliness with which a great Renaissance residence was filled. She employed the finest craftsmen, she gathered beautiful things, she created around herself an environment of cultivated splendour that expressed her wealth and her taste in every detail. In all this there was, beyond the mere display of riches, a genuine affection of beauty and a real discernment, for the favourite was a figure of cultivation as well as of ambition, and the mansions she made were not merely showy, but truly beautiful, monuments to the marriage of wealth and taste at the height of the Renaissance. Behind the public splendour, however, lay the private discipline of her daily life, the strict and ordered routine that sustained her famous beauty and her formidable command of affairs, and it is to a day in her orbit that we turn next. Behind the dazzling public image of the moon goddess lay a private life of remarkable discipline and order, for the Duchess de Poitiers governed her days with the same exacting control that she brought to everything else, and the routine of her existence was the secret engine of her enduring looks and her formidable competence. To picture a day in her orbit is to understand how the legend was sustained, for there was no magic in it, only an iron self-command that few of her contemporaries could have matched, and fewer still would have wished to. She rose, as we have seen, with the dawn, long before the rest of the court had stirred, and she began her day with the icy bath that was one of the foundations of her regimen, plunging into water that her pampered contemporaries would have found a torment. Then, while the morning was still fresh, she rode for hours hard and far through the parks and forests of her estates, keeping her body lean and strong with the exercise that was her powerful passion and her fine preserver. By the time the indolent ladies of the court were rising to their late and elaborate toilettes, Diane had already lived half a day of vigorous activity, and the freshness it gave her, the clear skin and the firm carriage and the bright eye, were the visible reward of her discipline. The middle of her day was given to the business of her vast affairs, for a woman of her wealth and sway had a great establishment to govern and great matters to attend to, and she attended to them herself with a personal grasp of detail that astonished those who dealt with her. She managed her estates, she pursued her revenues, she dictated her correspondence, she received the petitions and the appeals of those who sought her favour, she conferred with her agents and her allies, she conducted, in short, the affairs of a vast power. There was nothing idle or merely decorative about her existence, for behind the elegant surface worked a tireless administrator, and the hours that other grand ladies spent in gossip and amusement, Diane spent at her business. She rose, it was said, before the dawn, long before the rest of the court had stirred, and began her day with a cold bath, a practice almost unheard of in that age, and central to the legend of her preserved beauty. Then she would ride, for hours sometimes, through the woods and fields about whatever chateau she was lodged in, taking the hard exercise that kept her body firm and her health robust when other women of her years had long since grown heavy and infirm. Only then, having ridden and bathed and dressed, would she turn to the business of the day, the letters and the accounts and the suits of those who sought her favour, the management of her estates and the affairs of the kingdom, all conducted with the brisk efficiency of a mind that wasted nothing and forgot nothing. and woven through the day were the visits of the king, for Henri came to her constantly drawn by the devotion that never cooled, to sit with her and talk with her, and lay his cares before her, to take counsel and comfort from the one fixed point of his life. She was for him not merely a loveliness to be admired, but a companion to be confided in, a partner in his thoughts and his troubles, and the hours they spent together were the steady heartbeat of the reign. In the evening there were the entertainments and the ceremonies of the court, the suppers and the dances and the endless social theatre in which Diane presided as the first lady of the king's affections, cool and elegant and supreme. It was a full and a disciplined and a commanding life, and at its centre, sustaining all the rest, was the thing that most amazed her age, the loveliness that would not fade. To that enduring marvel we turn next. As the years of his reign went by, and she passed through her 40s and into her 50s and beyond, the thing that most astonished and most envied her contemporaries was the apparent refusal of her loveliness to fade with the passing of the seasons. While the women of her own generation grew old and stout and worn, as women did in that age of hard living and little medicine, Diane seemed to remain forever the same, slender and fresh and clear-skinned, holding the devotion of a king who was 20 years her junior, at an age when most women had long since been put aside. It seemed against nature, and the court marvelled and gossiped and could not account for it, and the legend of her ageless beauty grew with every year that passed. The wonder of it was real, for the testimony of those who saw her in her later seasons is consistent and remarkable. Ambassadors and courtiers who beheld her when she was past 50 wrote home in amazement that she seemed a woman of half her age, that her skin was fresh, and her figure trim, and her bearing as youthful as a girl's, that one could scarcely believe the time she carried. There was, of course, some flattery in such reports, for she was the most powerful woman in France, and it did no harm to praise her, but the consistency of the wonder, expressed even by those who had no reason to flatter her, suggests that there was a solid core of truth beneath it. Diane really did, by the standards of her generation, preserve her looks to an extraordinary degree. By every law of nature, she should long since have faded, should have become one more aging dowager among the many at court, and instead she went on season after season in a beauty that seemed to mock the calendar, and it was this, more than anything, that fed the legend of something more than mortal in her. The Venetian ambassadors, those shrewd and tireless observers who reported every detail of the courts to which they were sent, wrote of her looks with frank astonishment, recording that a woman of her decades should be so fresh and so lovely as to put the young beauties of the court to shame. At 50, at 60, she rode and hunted and held her place, her figure firm, her skin clear, her bearing erect, a living refutation of everything that the years were supposed to do to a woman. It seemed to her contemporaries almost a kind of magic, this defiance of the calendar, and it fed the legend of the huntress, for surely men felt there was something more than mortal in a beauty the years could not touch. There was, beneath the wonder, an element of the uncanny and even of the unsettling, for there is something not quite natural in a looks that defies the decades so completely, and it fed the whispers of secret arts and magic draughts that always followed her. Whatever the truth of the rumoured elixirs and potions, the effect upon the court and the king was profound, for the Duchess seemed to stand outside the ordinary law of time, a being apart, and that very strangeness was part of her authority. She was not merely a beautiful woman, but a kind of marvel, a living legend of perpetual youth, and the wonder of it bound the king to her all the more tightly, and confirmed her hold upon the imagination of the age. Yet society she ruled was being shaken in these very seasons by a powerful and dangerous upheaval, the rising tide of religious division, And Diane's place in that struggle is the next matter we must consider. The France in which she rose to authority was being shaken throughout the time of her ascendancy by one of the greatest upheavals in the history of Europe, the religious revolution that we call the Reformation, and the place that Diane took in that struggle is part of her story and one of the darker parts of it. For while she reigned in splendour at the court, the new Protestant faith was spreading through France, winning converts in the towns and among the nobility, and dividing the country into hostile camps of the old religion and the new, a division that would, in the time after Henry's death, erupt into decades of savage civil war. Diane stood firmly on the side of the old religion, the Catholic faith, and she used her great influence in support of it and against the rising Protestant movement. She was, by conviction and by interest alike, a defender of orthodoxy and the established order, for she belonged to the old world of the Catholic nobility and had no sympathy with the new ideas, and her instinct, like that of the king she guided, was to crush the heresy before it could take deeper root. Henri II was a determined persecutor of the Protestants, far harsher in this than his father had been, and he pursued the new faith with edicts and courts and burnings, and she is generally reckoned to have encouraged him in that severity, lending her weight to the party of repression. The persecution was grim, for the age was a cruel one in matters of faith, and those convicted of heresy faced the harshest of fates, and Diane's association with this policy is one of the shadows upon her reputation. Some accounts, indeed, lay a particular harshness at her door, suggesting that she pressed for severity against the Protestants out of zeal or interest, and that she profited, by one account, from the confiscated goods of the condemned. How far these charges are fair is hard now to judge, for much that was written of her was written by enemies, and the line between her own influence and the king's own settled policy is not easy to draw. But it is clear enough that she stood with the forces of repression, and that the gentler legend of the cultivated goddess must be set against the harder fact of her place amid the persecutors. The new doctrines of the Reformation were spreading through France in these decades, winning converts even among the nobility, and the crown set itself to stamp them out. For Henry was an orthodox Catholic and saw in heresy a threat to the order of his realm. There were persecutions, trials, and burnings. The grim apparatus of repression turned against those who held the forbidden beliefs, and Diane's name was associated, in the eyes of the reformers, with the harshest measures, for some of the confiscated property of the condemned came into her hands, and she was held to have an interest in the persecution. How far this is just to her is hard to say, for the matter is tangled and the sources are partisan, but it darkened her reputation amid the Protestants, who remembered her as an enemy. It is worth pausing on this, for it corrects the purely glamorous image of the favourite that her own myth-making has handed down, and reminds us that she was a creature of her age, and that her age was a hard and intolerant one. She was no saint, no gentle patroness of liberty and learning alone, but a powerful and a worldly woman who used her influence, among other things, in the service of a cruel orthodoxy, and the smoke of the burnings is part of the atmosphere of her reign, as surely as the splendour of Anet. Yet to her contemporaries, and to the king above all, she remained the dazzling and untouchable goddess, and the court over which she presided was, for all the darkness gathering at its edges, one of the most brilliant in Europe, a stage for festivals and tournaments of unmatched magnificence. To those great court spectacles, the dazzling theatre of the Valois at its height, we turn next. The court over which the favourite presided was, for all the religious darkness gathering at its edges, one of the most brilliant and splendid in Europe, a stage for festivals and ceremonies of a magnificence that dazzled all who beheld them. The Valois kings prized display above almost everything, understanding that the splendour of a court was itself a form of authority, a proclamation of the king's greatness made visible in gold and silk and spectacle, and Henri II carried on the tradition of his father with festivals of extraordinary lavishness. And at the centre of these dazzling occasions, presiding as the first lady of the king's affections, stood the cool and elegant figure of Diane, the moon huntress of the court, supreme in her austere, the severe livery. The grandest of the court spectacles were the royal entries, the ceremonial processions by which a king entered a leading city of his realm, occasions of overwhelming pageantry in which whole towns were transformed into theatres of welcome. Triumphal arches were raised in the streets, hung with allegories and inscriptions in the learned classical manner. Tableaux were staged at every turning. The guilds and the dignitaries marched in their finest array, and the king processed through it all in robes of state amid a roar of acclamation. The imagery of these entries was steeped in the classical learning the age adored, in gods and goddesses, and the heroes of antiquity, and again the figure of Diana the huntress appeared among them, a graceful complement to the woman who reigned beside the king. And then there were the tournaments, the vast martial spectacles in which the nobility displayed their courage and their skill, the descendants of the medieval jousts, dressed now in Renaissance splendour. The knights rode out in gorgeous array, their armour gleaming, their devices and colours proclaiming their allegiances, and Henry himself, a strong and an active man who loved the manly exercises, delighted to take his part in the lists. The ladies watched from the galleries, the prizes were awarded by the fairest hands, and the whole occasion was a brilliant fusion of athletic prowess and courtly display. These tournaments were amid the favourite entertainments of the reign, and the king's love of them would in the end prove his undoing, though no one watching the splendour could have guessed it. There were the royal entries. When the king came in state to one of his cities, and the citizens received him with arches and pageants and allegorical shows, there were the tournaments, the great passages of arms in which the nobility rode in the lists in fantastic costume. There were masques and balls and water festivals upon the waters, mounted with a lavishness that proclaimed the wealth and the refinement of the Valois. Through all of them moved Diane, presiding as the queen of the court splendour, her emblems woven into the very fabric of the celebration, the crescents and the entwined initials appearing among the decorations as openly as the arms of France. It was a world of loveliness pressed into the service of magnificence, the French Renaissance at its most dazzling, and Diane was its presiding genius, the figure in whose honour the whole brilliant show seemed staged. And there were the masques and the balls and the festivals without number, the endless round of elegant amusement by which the court beguiled its days, the music and the dancing and the feasting, the poetry and the play. It was a life of cultivated pleasure lived at the highest pitch of refinement, a life that prized beauty and wit and grace, and the Duchess moved through it as its presiding spirit, the embodiment of the cool classical elegance that the age admired. The splendour of that court has left its mark upon the imagination of history, a vision of Renaissance France at its most dazzling, and Diane stands at the heart of the vision, the deity of the moon presiding over the brilliant theatre of the Valois. Yet behind the public splendour lay the private realities of family and rivalry, and one of the strangest of these was Diane's intimate involvement with the offspring of the king and queen, to which we turn next. Stranger still than her power over the king was the part she played in the most private affairs of the royal family, for it was to Diane, and not to the children's own mother, that Henri entrusted the care of his offspring. Henri trusted her in this as in all things, and the arrangement, strange as it was, seems to have worked smoothly enough. The queen had little choice but to accept it, and the children themselves came to know the favourite as a fixture of their world. For Catherine, this was perhaps the bitterest of all the humiliations of her long subordination, to be supplanted not only as a wife but as a mother, to see her own the young placed under the supervision of her rival, to share the most intimate and personal of all a woman's roles with the favourite who had displaced her. That she endured it outwardly without protest is a measure of the iron self-control she had learned in her hard apprenticeship, and of the patience with which she awaited her hour. Beneath the composed surface, the resentment must have burned, and the memory of this time, when she was set aside even in her own nursery, surely fed the cold determination that would govern her conduct once Henri was gone and her time had come. It was Diane, and not the Queen, who was given the oversight of the royal nursery, the charge of the upbringing and the education and the health of the offspring whom Catherine bore, a strange and telling arrangement that placed the king's mistress in authority over the Queen's own offspring. She took the duty seriously, as she took every duty, attending to the children's welfare, supervising their governors and their tutors, writing letters of concern when one of them fell ill, ordering the affairs of the nursery with the same competence she brought to everything. There is something poignant in the picture of it. The Queen's offspring raised under the supervising eye of the woman who had supplanted their mother in the king's heart, and it speaks of the strange completeness of her ascendancy, that even this most intimate sphere was given into her hands. And yet there is evidence that Diane discharged her trust toward the young ones with genuine care, and that the relations between her and the young princes and princesses were not unkind, for she was, in her cool way, a conscientious guardian who looked to their interests. The future kings and queens of France grew up in part under her eye, and some of them retained in later life a regard for the favourite who had overseen their childhood. It was a tangled and an unnatural situation the mistress set over the Queen's own offspring, and it could not have existed in any but the strangest of mansion-holds, yet it functioned, held together, season upon season, by Henri's devotion and Diane's competence and Catherine's endurance. But the endurance had its limits, and the protracted rivalry between the Queen and the favourite, simmering beneath the surface of the court, is the next thread we must follow. To the deepening of that cold war we turn now. The rivalry between Diane de Poitiers and Catherine de Medici was the influenceful hidden drama of the years of rule, a cold and silent war of two formidable women fought out beneath the polished surface of the court, and it ran through the whole of Henri's reign like a buried current. On the surface, the two maintained a careful civility, even an appearance of friendship, for both were far too shrewd to let their enmity break into open conflict. But beneath the civility lay a deep and abiding antagonism, the natural hostility of the wife supplanted, and the mistress triumphant, sharpened by the daily humiliations of a situation that placed the Queen below the favourite. The humiliations were real and constant, for in 100 ways the precedence and the honour that should have belonged to the Queen flowed instead to the favourite. It was the mistress whose initials adorned the palaces, the mistress who received the choicest gifts, the mistress who held the king's confidence and shaped his policies, the mistress who oversaw the royal children, Catherine, the lawful queen, the mother of the heirs, was made to feel, day after day and season upon season, that she was the lesser figure, the one whom the king tolerated rather than loved, while the older woman reigned in his heart and at his side. There is a story, perhaps embroidered but telling, that the king divided his attentions and even his nights between the two by a kind of schedule, and that the Queen was made to know her secondary place in the most intimate of ways. Catherine swallowed it all, for she had no choice, and she presented to the world a face of patience and accommodation, even of deference toward her rival, biding her time with a self-command that concealed the depth of her feeling. She understood that while Henry lived, the Duchess was unassailable, secured by a love that nothing could shake, and that any open move against the favourite would only recoil upon herself. So she waited and watched and endured, storing up the memory of every slight nursing in silence the resentment that she dared not show, learning the lessons of patience and dissimulation that she would one day put to such formidable use. The unloved queen was schooling herself in these seasons of subordination for the day when she would rule. There were 1,000 small humiliations in the queen's position, 1,000 daily reminders of where she stood. At the festivals and ceremonies of the court, Diane took precedence that should have been the queen's. In the king's affections and the king's counsels, the favourite held the place that should have been the wife's. Even in matters of the household and the family, Catherine found herself overshadowed and set aside. She bore it all with a patience that astonished those who knew the pride and the temper that lay beneath, masking her resentment behind a smooth and watchful courtesy, waiting, always waiting, for the turn of fortune that must come at last. For Catherine understood what she perhaps preferred to forget, that the favourite was time older than the king, and that nature and time were, in the protracted run, upon the queen's side. And that day, both women knew, must come, for the entire towering structure of Diane's greatness rested upon a single life, the life of the king, and when that life ended, the balance of the court would shift in an instant. The favourite was 20 years Henri's senior, and by the ordinary course of nature, she should have died long before him, leaving Catherine to her eventual triumph in the natural way. But nature does not always run its ordinary course, and the blow that ended the years of his rule and overturned the rivalry, when it came not to the aged favourite, but to the king in the fullness of his strength, suddenly and from a clear sky. Before we reach that catastrophe, however, we must follow Henri through the wars and the policies of his reign, for the period of Diane's greatness were also years of conflict and strain for France. To the king's wars we turn next. The rule of Henri II, over which she presided as the uncrowned queen, was a reign of almost constant warfare, for France was locked throughout this period in the lengthy and bitter struggle with the House of Habsburg, the fine rival authority that ruled Spain and the Empire and half of Europe besides, and that hemmed France in on every frontier. The contest had begun under Henry's father, and would outlast his son, a generation's lengthy wrestling match between the two greatest powers of the Western world, fought across the fields of Italy and the Low Countries and the borders of France, draining the treasuries and the manhood of both sides in a struggle that neither could win outright. Henri threw himself into the wars with the energy of a soldier king, for he was a man of action who loved the manly exercises and took naturally to the business of command, and the campaigns of his rule were waged with vigour and with mixed fortune. There were victories and there were defeats, advances and retreats, the endless seesaw of a war of attrition between evenly matched giants. The most famous disaster of the decades of rule came in the year 1557, at the Battle of St. Quentin, where a French army was heavily defeated by the forces of Spain, a blow that opened the road toward Paris and threw the kingdom into alarm. Yet France recovered, as great kingdoms do, and the war ground on, and through it all the burden of cost and care pressed heavily upon the crown. Through these years of conflict, Diane remained at the centre of affairs, her influence undiminished by the strains of war, and she played her part in the great matters of the realm as she had always done. The factions that competed for control of policy, the mansion of Montmorency with which she was allied and the house of Guise that rose to prominence through the wars, jostled for the king's ear, and the Duchess was at the heart of the manoeuvring, advancing her friends and managing her interests amid the shifting fortunes of the conflict. The wars brought opportunities as well as dangers for those near the throne, offices and commands, and the chance of glory and gain, and Diane, ever watchful of the interests of herself and her allies, missed none of them. The reign of Henry II was filled with war, the long and ruinous struggle against the Emperor Charles V, and then against his son Philip of Spain, a contest for the mastery of Europe that drained the treasury and spent the lives of Frenchmen across a generation. There were campaigns in Italy, and on the northern frontier, victories and defeats, the vast disaster of Saint-Quentin, where a French army was shattered by the Spanish, and the brilliant recovery of Calais, wrested at last from the English, who had held it for 200 decades. Through all of it, Diane remained at the centre of affairs, for war was the business of the king, and the king's business flowed through her, and she watched the fortunes of France rise and fall through the many seasons of conflict. The long struggle exhausted both France and its grand rival, and by the late 1550s both crowns were sinking under the weight of debt and weariness, and the desire for peace grew strong on every side. The kings of the age made war for glory and advantage, but war was ruinously expensive, and even the mightiest treasuries had their limits, and the time came at last when both the powerful antagonists were ready to lay down their arms and seek a settlement. The peace that ended the long wars, when it came, was a great and a famous one, sealed with marriages and celebrated with festivals of overwhelming splendour, and it brought to the court of France a season of rejoicing that none could have known was to end in catastrophe. To that fateful peace, and to the celebrations that attended it, we turn next, in the spring of 1559, after decades of ruinous warfare. France and the House of Habsburg laid down their arms at last, and concluded a great peace, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, brought to a close the protracted struggle between the two greatest powers of Europe. It was a famous and a far-reaching settlement, redrawing the map of influence across the continent, and though France gave up much that she had won in Italy, the peace brought a blessed relief from the burden of war, an end to the bloodshed, and the crushing expense that had drained the kingdom for a generation. Both sides were exhausted, both treasuries were empty, and the settlement was welcomed with rejoicing as the dawn of a new and a happier age. As was the custom of the time, the peace was to be sealed and cemented by marriages, the binding of royal houses in alliance through the union of their children, and 2 such marriages were arranged to mark the leading settlement. Henri's own daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, was to be wed to the King of Spain himself, Philip II, the mightiest monarch in the world, and Henri's sister was to marry the Duke of Savoy, an important ally on France's eastern flank. These were matches of the highest consequence, knitting the peace into the very fabric of Europe's ruling families, and they called for celebrations of a magnificence befitting the occasion, festivals of rejoicing, to mark the end of war and the dawn of friendship. So the court of France gave itself over, in the early summer, to a season of festivity, such as even that splendour-loving age had rarely seen, a vast round of ceremonies and banquets and entertainments to celebrate the peace and the royal marriages. The capital was decked for rejoicing, the nobility gathered in their finest array, and the whole brilliant apparatus of Valois magnificence was brought out for the occasion. At the heart of it all, presiding as ever, was the favourite, now approaching her 60th year, and still the first lady of the king's affections, the moon goddess of the court in her austere and elegant black and white, supreme at the summit of a kingdom at peace. The terms were hard for France, which gave up much that her armies had bled for, surrendering her long ambitions in Italy and acknowledging the Spanish mastery there, and many a French soldier felt the peace as a defeat. But the treasury was empty and the country weary, and peace on almost any terms was welcome, and so the long war was wound up at last, and the courts of France and Spain turned from fighting to the festivities that were to seal their new friendship. It was in a sense the high noon of her greatness, this season of triumph and rejoicing, the moment when everything she had built stood complete and unshaken, the king's devotion as strong as ever, her authority undiminished, her face still the wonder of the court, the peace bringing a golden close to the years of his rule, over which she had presided for a dozen seasons. She could not have known, as the festivals unfolded in the summer sunshine, that she stood at the very edge of catastrophe, that the celebrations of the peace would be the occasion of the disaster that would destroy her, that within days the whole shining structure of her life would be shattered beyond repair. For the marriages were to be celebrated, as such fine occasions always were, with a tournament, and it was in that tournament that fate was waiting. To the fatal contest in the Paris street we turn next. The summer of 1559 came in hot and bright over Paris, and the city gave itself over to celebration, for the great peace had been signed, and the royal marriages were to be solemnized, and all the splendour of the Valois court was poured out into a season of festival. There were banquets and balls and processions through the streets, and at the centre of it all there was to be a tournament, a grand passage of arms in the old chivalric style, held in the broad street of Saint-Antoine before the gloomy bulk of the Tournelles' palace, where the court was lodged. The lists were built and railed off, the stands raised for the spectators, the ground strewn and prepared, and all of fashionable France gathered to watch the flower of the nobility ride against one another in the bright June heat. Henri II loved these contests above almost any other pleasure, for he was a man of great physical vigour, a fine horseman, and a practised jouster, and he delighted in the chance to display his strength and skill before his court. He was 40 years old that summer, still powerful and active, and he meant to take his part in the tournament himself, to ride in the lists against his own nobles as the champion of the festival. It was the custom of the age for kings to do so, and Henri, who had spent his life in the saddle and the tilt-yard, had no fear of it, and looked forward to the days of jousting with the keen anticipation of a man in his element. Diane de Poitiers was there, of course, throned among the great ladies in the stands, the most honoured woman present, watching her king ride in the lists, as she had watched him 100 times before. She wore, as ever, her dark and pale livery, the colours that were also, by a strange and fateful chance, the colours of the king, and Henri rode that summer with her favour, and in her livery, proclaiming before all the world, as he had proclaimed for 30 years, whose knight he was. Catherine de Medici was there too, the queen seated in her own place of honour, watching the same lists with very different eyes, for the queen, it was said, had been troubled by dark forebodings about the tournament, by dreams and warnings that she could not shake off. The lists were set up in the broad street of Saint-Antoine, before the old palace of the Tournelles, and the stands were raised on either side, hung with tapestries and crowded with the whole brilliant assembly of the court, the ladies in their jewels, the nobles in their finery, the ambassadors of foreign sways come to witness the celebrations of the peace. The June sun beat down upon the scene, fierce and bright, glinting upon the armour of the jousters and the trappings of their horses, and the air rang with the trumpets and the cheering and the thunder of hoofs as course after course was run. It was the very image of the chivalric splendour that the age loved, the flower of French nobility displaying its courage and its skill, and at the heart of it rode the king, in his wife's colours and his mistresses, the champion of the festival. For there were omens, or so it was remembered afterwards, when men looked back and read the signs they had missed. The queen had dreamed, it was said, of the king lying wounded and bloody, and an astrologer had foretold that Henri should beware a wound to the head in single combat, and the grand seer of the age had written words that seemed, in hindsight, to point straight at the disaster to come. Catherine had begged her husband, men said later, not to ride, to keep out of the lists, to let the omens go unfulfilled. But Henri laughed away her fears, as vigorous men laugh away the warnings of the anxious, and the tournament went forward, and the king rode, and the bright days of jousting unrolled under the burning sky toward the afternoon that was waiting at the end of them, To that afternoon we turn next. The 30th of June was the final afternoon of the tournament, and the king had ridden well through the festival, holding his own against the best of his nobles, carrying himself with the strength and skill that were his pride. The afternoon wore on, hot and golden. The crowd grew weary. The shadows lengthened across the lists, and the contests drew toward their close. Henri had run his courses and acquitted himself with honour, and the time had come to make an end. But the king, flushed with exertion and unwilling to leave the field, called for one more course, one final passage of arms, and he summoned a young captain of his Scottish guard, the Comte de Montgomery, to ride against him once again. Montgomery was reluctant, for he had already broken a lance against the king and had no wish to ride again in the failing light, and he begged to be excused. But Henri insisted, as kings could insist, and the youthful man yielded, and the two of them took their places at the ends of the lists, and lowered their lances and spurred their horses forward for the last course of the day. They met in the middle of the field with the crash of the encounter, lance against shield and armour, and both lances held and then shattered with the force of the meeting, as lances were meant to do. But in that instant something went terribly wrong. For Montgomery, riding on past the king after the impact, failed to drop the splintered stump of his broken lance in time, as the rules of the sport required, and the jagged end of it struck the king upon the head. Henry's visor, it seems, had not been properly secured, or was thrown up by the blow, and the splinters of the shattered lance drove in beneath it into the king's face above the eye. He reeled in the saddle and slumped, and would have fallen but for those who ran to catch him, and he was lifted down from his horse grievously wounded, the broken wood driven deep into his head. The bright afternoon of festival had become, in a single instant, a scene of horror, and the King of France lay stricken upon the ground, while the crowd looked on in stunned and dawning understanding. The surgeons who were summoned to him were the finest in France, among them the influenceful Ambroise Paré, the most celebrated of all the surgeons of the age, and they laboured over the king with every art and every device that their science could command. They probed the wound, they studied the manner of the injury, they tried, it was said, to understand it by examining the heads of men lately executed, that they might see what such a splinter did when it drove into the skull. But the wound was beyond their power to heal, for the splinters had driven deep above the eye and into the brain, and infection followed, and the king's strong body could not throw it off. Day by day he sank, through fever and delirium, and the slow advance of the poison in his blood, while the court watched and prayed and waited. He did not die at once. He was carried from the lists into the Tournel's palace nearby, conscious still, and the finest physicians in France were summoned to him, and for a brief while there was hope that he might yet recover. But the wound was mortal, for the splinters had pierced deep, and infection set in, and the king sank by slow degrees through 11 days of suffering toward his end. The greatest surgeons of the age laboured over him, tried every art they knew, even, it was said, experimenting upon the heads of condemned criminals to study the manner of the injury, but nothing could be done. The lance that had shattered in the summer evening had dealt a wound that no skill could heal, and Henri II was dying, and in that time the whole world of her de Poitiers was overturned, for at the bedside of the dying king there was no place for her at all. To that bedside, and to the lengthy watch of his dying, we turn next. For 11 days Henri II lay dying in the Tournel's palace, and through all those days the woman who had held his heart for the whole of his adult life was kept away from him, shut out from the chamber where he suffered, denied even the chance to say farewell. For at the bedside of the dying king sat Catherine de Medici, his wife and his queen, and Catherine, after 30 the time of patience and humiliation, had at last her hour, and she used it. The sick room was hers to command, and she gave her orders, and the orders were that she should not be admitted, should not come near, should have no part in the passing of the man she had loved. It was the Queen's first act of influence, the first exercise of the authority that her husband's death was about to place in her hands, and it was aimed with deadly precision at the heart of her old rival. For 3 decades Catherine had yielded to Diane, had endured her presence and her precedence, had watched the favourite take the place beside the king that should have been the Queen's. Now, at the end, Catherine took her revenge in the surest way, by claiming the dying king wholly for herself and excluding the mistress utterly. Diane, who had been the centre of Henri's world for the whole of his rule, was left outside, in her lodgings, waiting for news, while the Queen kept watch within. It is said that the dying king, in his lucid intervals, asked for Diane, called for her by name, wished to see her one last time. Whether this is true cannot now be known, but if it is, the wish was not granted, for Catherine held the door, and the favourite was kept away. And there is a story, true or not, that the Queen sent to Diane, even in those days of the king's dying, demanding the return of the crown jewels that Henri had given her, the great gems that belonged not to the favourite, but to the crown of France. Diane, it is said, asked whether the king was dead yet, and when she was told that he still lived, she answered with the icy composure that had always been hers, that while the king breathed, she had no master but him, and feared no one, and would surrender nothing. It was the last flash of her old authority, the final assertion of the position she had held for so long, and it was already, though she did not yet fully know it, an empty defiance. It was a strange and terrible reversal, this exclusion of the favourite from the deathbed, for she had been the centre of Henri's life for 30 years, the woman to whom he turned in everything, and now at the end she was shut out, kept from him by the wife who had endured so long in her shadow. The Queen had no need now of pretence or patience, for the king was dying and her hour had come, and she used her new authority at once in this first and most personal way to bar her rival from the chamber. And Diane, for her part, did not force the matter, did not make a scene or a scandal, but withdrew to her lodgings and waited, with the icy composure that never deserted her, for the news that would end her reign. For the king was dying, and when he died, everything would change. The whole vast structure of Diane's greatness, her wealth, her influence, her primacy at court, her possession of Chenonceau and her duchy and her grants, all of it rested upon the life of one man, and that life was guttering out, hour by hour. In the sick room from which she was barred, she had risen with Henri, had been made by his devotion, had ruled France in all but name through her hold upon his heart, and now Henri was leaving her, and with him would go the foundation of everything she was. On the 10th of July, in the year 1559, the long watch ended. The king was dead, and the reign of the favourite was over. To the changed world that his passing made, we turn next. The death of Henry II changed the world of the French court in an instant, as the death of a king always did, and nowhere was the change more total than in the position of her de Poitiers. While Henri lived, she had been the most powerful woman in France, courted and feared, the channel to the king, the uncrowned queen whose favour made and unmade fortunes. The moment he died, she was nothing of the kind, for her authority had never been her own but only the reflection of his love, and with his death the light that had made her shine was extinguished. The crowds of courtiers who had thronged her apartments melted away. The suitors and the flatterers turned their faces elsewhere, and the favourite found herself, overnight, alone. The sway at court flowed always toward the throne, and the throne had a new occupant now. Henry's eldest son came to the crown as Francis II, a boy of 15, sickly and weak, married already to Mary, the young Queen of Scots, and wholly unfit to rule in his own right. The real power passed to those who stood about the boy king, and chief amid them, rising now into the authority she had waited for through 3 decades of patience, was his mother, Catherine de Medici, the queen who was now the queen mother and who meant to rule. The long humiliation of Catherine was over, and her lengthy ascendancy was beginning, and her first concern, in the bright dawn of her influence, was the settling of her account with her old rival. For Diane there was no longer any protection. The man whose love had shielded her was gone, and in his place sat a woman who had every reason to hate her and now had every means to ruin her. The whole court understood the new arithmetic at once, understood that the favourite was finished, that the moon goddess had set with the sun whose light she had borrowed. Those who had bowed lowest to the favourite in her greatness were often the quickest to abandon her now, for such is the way of courts, and the woman who had reigned for so much time found society grown suddenly cold around her. The structure of her life, built up over 30 period, began to come down, and there was nothing she could do to hold it. The young king who now wore the crown, Francis II, was a boy of 15, sickly and feeble, and his brief reign was dominated by the families that stood about him, above all by the mansion of Guise, the uncles of his young queen, Mary of Scotland, who seized the direction of affairs. But behind them all, watching and waiting and gathering the threads of authority into her own hands, was the Queen Mother, Catherine, who had endured so much and waited so long and now meant to rule. The passing of Henry had not only ended Diane's greatness, it had transformed the whole balance of the kingdom, raising the long-suffering queen to the height of authority and casting down the favourite who had overshadowed her, and the court adjusted itself, with the swift instinct of courts, to the new arrangement of the world. And yet, in the manner of her fall, Diane de Poitiers showed something of the quality that had carried her so far, for she did not rage or plead or cling, but met the ruin of her fortunes with the cool composure that had always been the mark of her. She had known none better, that her greatness rested upon the king's life, that what the crown had given the crown could take away, and now that the day of reckoning had come she faced it with her head high, asking no mercy and showing no fear. She would lose much in the weeks to come, would be stripped of the jewels and the chair palace that had been the emblems of her power, but she would not lose her dignity, and she would not give Catherine the satisfaction of seeing her broken. To the reckoning itself, the Queen's settling of the protracted account, we turn next. The reckoning, when it came, was conducted by Catherine de Medici with a restraint that was, in its way, more crushing than open vengeance would have been. The Queen Mother did not have her rival imprisoned or banished or destroyed, did not stoop to the cruelty that a smaller spirit might have indulged, but exacted instead a cold and measured justice, taking back from Diane the things that had been the crown's, and leaving her, stripped of her glory, to retire into a wealthy and dishonoured obscurity. It was the revenge of a patient woman who had waited 3 decades and could afford, now, to be exact rather than savage, and it was none the less complete for being quietly done. The first demand was for the crown jewels, the great gems that Henri had lavished upon his mistress, and that belonged in truth not to her, but to the crown of France. These she was required to surrender, and surrender them she did. The diamonds and the pearls and the precious stones that had blazed upon her at the festivals of her greatness, handing back into Catherine's keeping the treasure that had adorned the uncrowned queen. It was a heavy loss, but it was only the beginning, for the Queen Mother had set her heart upon a greater prize, the prize she had coveted through all the many decades of her humiliation, the river palace of Chenonceau. Chenonceau was the jewel of Diane's possessions, the exquisite house upon the chair that she had made affectionlier than any other in France, and Catherine had desired it with a deep and lasting desire from the moment the king had given it away. Now she would have it. The legal pretext was found readily enough, for Chenonceau was crown property and its grant to Diane could be challenged, and Catherine offered, with cold correctness, an exchange. Diane should give up Chenonceau and receive in its place the chateau of Chaumont, a fine residence in its own right, but no equal to the Water Palace, and the exchange should be conducted with all the forms of law, so that no one could say the favourite had been simply robbed. The Duchess had no choice but to accept, and so the loveliest of her houses passed into the hands of her rival, and Catherine took possession of the prize at last. There was a grim symmetry in the exchange of Chenonceau for Chaumont, for Catherine had been made to swallow many humiliations in her time, and now she repaid them, taking from Diane the mansion she loved best, and giving in return a house that, however fine, could never be its equal. Chaumont was a leading chateau in its own right, set high above the Loire, no mean consolation by any ordinary measure, but it was not Chenonceau, not the river palace into which she had poured her art and her heart, and both women knew it. The exchange was conducted with every form of legal correctness, so that nothing could be called theft, and yet everyone understood it for what it was, the victor taking the spoils, the Queen claiming at last the prize she had coveted for 20 years. Diane did, in fact, spend some time at Chaumont after the exchange, and she set about improving it in her usual way, but her heart was never in it, for it was a place forced upon her by her enemy, a monument to her defeat rather than her taste. She soon withdrew from it to her own beloved Anet, and Chaumont passed out of her life, a brief and unhappy episode in the long story of her possessions. The truth was that the loss of Chenonceau had broken something, had marked the final end of her old life, and no other house, however fine, could make that good. It was a bitter loss, the loss of Chenonceau, for the Duchess had poured her art and her devotion into that residence, had made it the very emblem of her position, had spent there the happiest hours of her greatness. To give it up to Catherine, of all people, to see her rival installed in the river palace she had created, must have been among the hardest things she was called upon to bear. Yet she bore it, as she bore all her losses, with composure, accepting the exchange, retiring from the residence she loved, yielding to the new order of things without a public murmur. She had lost the jewels and the river palace, had lost her place at court and her authority in the kingdom, but she had not lost everything, for she still had her own noble house, the matchless Anet that was hers by right and not by royal grant, and to Anet she now withdrew. To that retreat we turn next. To Anet, then, she withdrew, and it was a retreat that, for all the losses that had driven her to it, was very far from a disgrace. For Anet was her own, built of her own wealth upon her own land, the finest Renaissance mansion in France, a palace fit for the goddess she had fashioned herself into, and in retiring to it, she was not creeping away to hide, but withdrawing in state to a kingdom that remained entirely hers. She had been stripped of the crown jewels and of Chenonceau, had lost her influence at court and her primacy in the country, but she remained one of the richest women in France, mistress of vast estates, Duchess of Valentinois, and the lady of one of the most beautiful houses ever built. Her fall was real, but it was the fall of a great lady into a magnificent retirement, not the ruin of a broken woman. At Anet she gathered the threads of her diminished but still considerable life, and she lived there, in the time that remained to her, with a dignity and a grandeur that nothing in her fall had touched. The residence received her as its goddess, for she had built it in her own image, had stamped her myth and her initials and her crescent moons into every stone of it, and within its walls she was still, as she had always been, the centre of her own world. She presided over her household, managed her vast estates with the shrewd competence that had always been hers, dispensed her charity, and maintained the state proper to a duchess. undiminished in her own domain whatever she had lost at court. There was a kind of vindication in this retreat, for it showed that the favourite had been wise, through all the time of her greatness, to build herself a foundation that did not depend upon the crown. The jewels and the chair palace had been the king's to give and the queen's to take away, but Anet was hers, bought and built with her own resources, beyond the reach of Catherine's revenge. The woman who had been so careful, so disciplined, so prudent in the management of her fortunes, had provided against the evil day, and when the day came, she had somewhere of her own to go, a fine seat that no one could take from her, where she could live out her years in the dignity that befitted what she had been. There was no shortage of the means of dignity in her retreat, for Anet was a palace, and she kept it as one, maintaining a great household, receiving such visitors as still sought her out, presiding over her domain with the state of the Duchess she remained. The losses she had suffered, real as they were, had touched only the part of her wealth that depended upon the crown. The fine private fortune she had so prudently built remained hers, and she lived in her retirement, not as a fallen woman scraping by on charity, but as one of the richest and grandest ladies in France, diminished in power, but not in substance. It made all the difference, that foresight of hers between a ruin and a retirement, and she had the satisfaction, in her last years, of reaping what her prudence had sown. And so she came home, in a sense, to the one place that had always been most truly hers, the house she had raised from nothing to be the wonder of France, and there she would pass the remainder of her days. If she grieved for all that she had lost, the king and the power and the river palace, she did not show it to the world, but took up her existence as the great Lady of Anet with the same composed dignity she had brought to every other part of her existence. And so the huntress withdrew into her temple, the moon lady into her chateau of moons, to pass the evening of her life in the place she had made. The bright noon of her power was over. The years of her, the decades of his rule at the side of the king, were gone forever. But the woman herself remained undefeated in spirit, still grand, still composed, still mistress of her own great domain. She had ruled France in all but name and lost it all in an afternoon, and she met the loss with a composure that was, perhaps, the truest measure of her strength. To the last years of her life, the days of the Lady of Anet, we turn next. The time of the favourite de Poitiers, the period of her retirement at Anet, were lived in a manner that did honour to all that had gone before, for she did not decline into bitterness or idleness, but maintained to the end the discipline and the grandeur and the purposeful activity that had marked her whole life. She was approaching 60 when she withdrew to Anet, an age at which most of her contemporaries were long since worn out or dead, but she retained still the famous vigour and the famous beauty, riding out as she had always done, rising early, keeping the strict and active regimen that had preserved her so remarkably through the period. The Lady of Anet was old now, by the reckoning of her age, but she carried her seasons, as she had carried everything else, with a straight back and an unbowed head. She gave much of her energy in these final years to the management of her estates and the ordering of her affairs, for she was a great landowner with vast properties to oversee, and she attended to the business of them with the same shrewd competence that had always been hers. She was, by all accounts, an excellent woman of business, careful and exact, attentive to her rents and her accounts and her lawsuits, and she kept her vast fortune in good order to the end. There was nothing dreamy or broken about Diane in her retirement. She was as practical and as capable as she had ever been, a formidable manager of a formidable inheritance, and she ruled her domain at Anet with the firm hand of long habit. She gave herself, too, to works of charity and piety, as became a grand lady in the evening of her life, founding and endowing religious institutions, relieving the poor of her districts, attending to the spiritual concerns that pressed more nearly as the end drew closer. She had built, beside her noble house at Anet, a chapel of exquisite beauty, and she now made provision for a place of burial there, a tomb where she should lie at last, and she ordered these matters with the same care she had given to everything, preparing for her death as she had prepared for everything else in her ordered and disciplined life. The goddess was making ready, in her own time and her own way, for the one thing that no discipline could hold off forever. She had her grandchildren about her now, and the affairs of her family to attend to, the marriages and the inheritances and the fortunes of the family she had raised so high. Her 2 daughters had married into the grand nobility, and through them and their children Diane's blood was woven into the first families of France, so that her line, if not her authority, would endure. She watched over these connections with the same care she had always given to the management of her interests, the matriarch of a great line ordering its affairs from her retreat at Anet, undiminished in her authority over her own. The sphere of the court might have passed her by, but the world of her family and her estates was hers still, and she ruled it to the end with the firm and capable hand of long habit. And so the seasons passed at Anet, quiet and grand, and ordered, the closing time of a great lady living out her days in the house she had built, undiminished in dignity. Still beautiful, still active, still herself. The court she had ruled was far away now, given over to Catherine and the troubles of the young king's reign, and the Duchess had no part in it any longer. But she seems not to have repined, seems to have found in her retreat a peace and a sufficiency that her years of power, for all their splendour, had perhaps never given her. She had been the most powerful woman in France, and was so no longer, and she met the change with the equanimity of one who had always known how to master herself. The end, when it came as such ends do, and to it we turn next. Diane de Poitiers died at Anet in the spring of 1566, in her 66th year, having outlived by 7 years the king whose love had made her and whose death had unmade her. The manner of her dying was quiet and fitting, the close of a long and ordered life in the great house she had built, and she met it, by all accounts, with the same composure that had marked her living, making her peace, setting her affairs in order, yielding up her spirit without struggle or terror. She had prepared for this hour with the same care she had given to all the rest, and when it came she was ready, and she died as she had lived, with dignity and self-possession, the goddess laid down at last. There is a story, often told, that her death was hastened by a fall from her horse, or by the protracted effects of the regimen she had followed to preserve her beauty, the cold baths and the draughts of gold, that, in the medicine of a later age, were thought perhaps to have poisoned her by slow degrees. Whether there is truth in this cannot now be certainly known, and the tale of the gold may be no more than a legend grown up around her famous looks. What is certain is that she died at Anet, full of years, in possession of her faculties and her fortune, a leading lady to the end, and that she was laid to rest, as she had wished, in the beautiful chapel she had built beside her house, the deity sleeping in her temple. She was buried with the honours due to her rank in the tomb she had prepared beneath the walls that bore her image in every stone, and for a time she lay there undisturbed, the Lady of Anet at rest in the midst of her own creation. The vast beauty was gone, the famous discipline ended, the long self-fashioning complete, and she passed into history and into legend. The woman who had held a king for the whole of his life, who had ruled France in all but name, who had built the loveliest of houses and made of herself a living goddess, and who had lost it all in a single summer afternoon and borne the loss with an unbroken pride. her body would not in the end be left in peace forever, for in a later and more violent age the revolutionaries would break open her tomb and scatter her remains. But that lay far in the future, and for now she slept where she had wished to sleep. She was 66 years old when she died, a great age for that era, having lived through one of the most extraordinary reversals of fortune that any woman of her time had known, from the heights of influence to the quiet of retirement, and had borne both with the same unbroken composure. The chapel at Anet received her, the beautiful chapel she had raised beside her house, and there she was laid in the tomb she had prepared, beneath the roof her had built, surrounded by the emblems of the deity she had made of herself. It was a fitting end for the Lady of Anet to lie at last in the temple of her own creation, the moon goddess gone to her rest in the mansion of moons. So ended the life of the favourite Duchesse de Valentinois, mistress of Henri II of France, one of the most remarkable women of her remarkable age. She had been born into the old nobility, had married an old man and buried him, had captured the heart of a king and held it for 30 years, had risen to a sway and a wealth and a fame that few women of any age have known, and had fallen from it all in an afternoon, and lived out her seasons in a magnificent and dignified retreat. The bright Valois court she had adorned was already at her death, sliding toward the lengthy agony of the wars of religion, and the world she had known was passing away. To what became of that world and of all she had been, we turn next. The world that Diane de Poitiers left behind her did not protracted survive her in the form she had known it, for the bright and brilliant Valois court, the court of festivals and tournaments and Renaissance splendour over which she had presided as the moon huntress, was already at her death, descending into the long darkness of the wars of religion. The France of Henri II, outwardly so magnificent, had been riven beneath the surface by the powerful quarrel of the age, the division between the old faith and the new, and after Henri's passing that division broke open into open and savage conflict, a series of civil wars that would tear the kingdom apart for the rest of the century. The age of splendour was giving way to an age of blood. At the centre of the new age stood Catherine de Medici, the woman who had waited for so much time in Diane's shadow, and who now, in her widowhood, came into the fullness of the authority she had craved. For 3 decades, Catherine had been the queen who yielded precedence to the mistress, the wife who watched her husband give his heart and his treasure to another woman, the patient Florentine who endured and waited and bided her time. Now she was the queen mother, the dominant figure in the realm, ruling through her sons, 3 of whom would wear the crown in their turn, steering France through the chaos of the religious wars with all the cunning and the ruthlessness that her lengthy apprenticeship in patience had taught her. The shadow had become the substance, and Catherine would dominate France for 30 seasons more. It is one of the ironies of the story that Catherine, who had been so overshadowed in life by her rival, so thoroughly outdone in loveliness and in influence, and in the attachment of the king, should in the end have so completely outlasted and overtaken her. Diane had won every battle of their lengthy rivalry while Henri lived, had held the king and the influence and the precedence, had forced the queen into the background season upon season. But Catherine won the war, for she had youth on her side, or at least the time, and she had patience beyond measure. And when the king died, she took everything, the authority and the palace and the kingdom itself, and ruled where the favourite had only ever reigned by proxy. The tortoise had outrun the hare in the end. The young King Francis II lived barely a year upon the throne, dying while still a boy, and the crown passed to his brother, a child of 10, with Catherine ruling now openly as regent for her son. 3 of her sons would wear the crown of France in their turn, and through all their reigns the Queen Mother would be the dominant force in the kingdom, holding the realm together by craft and marriage and ruthless calculation through the long agony of the religious wars. It was a dark and bloody age that followed the bright noon of Henry's reign, an age of massacre and civil war, and Catherine moved through it as its presiding genius, the patient Florentine who had waited so long and now held the fate of France in her hands. The civil wars that followed were among the most terrible in the history of France, a succession of religious conflicts that ran on for the better part of 40 years, marked by massacre and assassination and the slow bleeding of the kingdom, and through them all, Catherine laboured to hold the crown upon the heads of her sons. It was a grim inheritance for the woman who had waited so long to rule, and it consumed the rest of her life, so that her triumph over Diane, when set against the troubles that came with it, can hardly be counted a happy one. The bright world of Henry's reign, in which Diane had shone, came to seem in retrospect a lost golden age, the last untroubled summer before the storm. As for Anet, the noble house that Diane had built, it passed after her death to her descendants, and then through various hands down the centuries, and it survived, though much altered and diminished, as a monument to the woman who had raised it. The river palace of Chenonceau, which Catherine had taken from her, became one of the Queen Mother's favourite residences, and Catherine in her turn stamped it with her own building and her own gardens, so that the loveliest mansion in France bears to this day the marks of both the rivals who possessed it. The two women are joined forever in the story of that house upon the river, the mistress who made it and the queen who took it, and something of both of them lingers in its beautiful stones. To the final question of what Diane de Poitiers really was, we turn next. It is worth pausing at the end to ask what we are to make of her, this woman who rose so high and fell so far, who held a king for the whole of his life and made herself into a living goddess and lost it all in an afternoon. She has been judged in many ways across the centuries, and the judgments have ranged from admiration to condemnation, for she was a figure who could be read in very different lights, and the truth of her is not easy to fix. To some she has seemed an icy and grasping schemer, a calculating woman who used her loveliness and her wits to capture a king and enrich herself, who cared more for power and possessions than for love, and who fashioned her famous myth out of pure ambition. To others she has seemed a fine lady, a woman of dignity and discipline and real ability, who inspired a genuine and lifelong love, and bore both her greatness and her fall with an admirable composure. There is evidence for both views, for Diane was a complex woman, and the elements of her character did not all point the same way. She was, beyond question, calculating, careful, prudent, a shrewd manager of her own advantage, who never lost her head and never failed to provide against the future. The very discipline that preserved her looks, the cold baths and the strict regimen, speaks of a will of iron and a self-command that could seem almost inhuman, and her careful building of a fortune beyond the reach of royal whim shows a mind always alert to its own interest. She was not a woman swept away by passion, but one who kept her balance through everything, and there is something cool, even cold, at the centre of her, that resists the warmth we should like to find there. And yet to see her only as a cold schemer is to miss too much, for there was more to her than calculation. The devotion she inspired in Henri was real and lifelong, and it is hard to believe that a merely grasping woman could have held a man's heart so completely for so much time, through all the time and all the changes of his life. There was evidently something in her, some quality of strength and steadiness and grace that answered a deep need in the wounded boy who became the king, and gave him, in her, the fixed point his life had always lacked, and her conduct in her fall, the dignity and composure with which she met the ruin of her fortunes, speaks of a real largeness of spirit, a genuine nobility that mere ambition could not have counterfeited. Those who knew her best, or claimed to, left accounts that do not entirely agree, some praising her wisdom and her dignity and the genuine attachment she inspired, others hinting at coldness and calculation and a heart that loved possessions more than people. The truth, as so often, likely lay somewhere between, in a nature that was neither the scheming villainess of her detractors nor the flawless heroine of her admirers, but a real and complicated woman, formidable and disciplined, and not without warmth, who played the hand that fortune dealt her with consummate skill and held her course through everything with an unbroken will. It is worth remembering, too, that almost everything we know of her comes filtered through the eyes of others, through the reports of ambassadors, and the gossip of courtiers, and the verdicts of historians writing long after her death, and that the woman herself, behind the myth and the legend, remains in many ways unknowable. She left no diary, no confession, no intimate record of her own thoughts and feelings, only the houses she built, and the image she projected, and the actions she took, and from these we must reconstruct her as best we can. The Diane we see is, in a sense, the Diane she chose to show, the goddess of the public image, and the private woman behind that polished surface kept her own counsel to the end. Perhaps the truest thing to say is that she was both, that the coldness and the grandeur were two sides of the one nature, that the discipline which could seem so calculating was also the source of her strength and her dignity. She was a woman who mastered herself utterly, who made of her own life a work of art as deliberate as the residence she built, and who carried through that self-creation with a consistency that commands a kind of awe, even when it fails to command affection. She was not perhaps a warm woman, but she was a great one, in her icy and disciplined way, and the myth she made of herself, the moon deity in the severe livery, was the perfect expression of a nature that turned everything, even beauty, even love, into something shaped and ordered and controlled. To a last reflection upon her and upon the meaning of her story we turn now. There is, at the heart of the story of the favourite, a meditation upon beauty and sway and time that gives it a resonance beyond the particular facts of one woman's life. For her whole career was built upon her face, upon the extraordinary loveliness that captured a king and held him, and beauty is the most fragile of all foundations, the thing that period most surely destroys. Yet Diane defied time longer than any woman of her age was thought able to do, kept her looks into her 60s through sheer discipline and will, and made of the preservation of it a kind of triumph over the very nature of things. There is something both magnificent and a little sad in this, in the spectacle of a woman waging so long and so successful a war against the years, and yet knowing, as she must have known, that it was a war that could only end one way. And there is, in her story, a meditation too upon the nature of power, and upon how much of it a woman of her age could hold, and how little of it was truly her own. Diane wielded enormous authority for 3 decades, ruled France in all but name, made and unmade fortunes, shaped the policy of the kingdom through her hold upon the king, and yet none of it was hers in her own right. All of it flowed from the devotion of one man, and when that man died it vanished like a dream, leaving her stripped and diminished in a single afternoon. The authority of the favourite was always a borrowed power, a reflected light, and Diane's fall is the classic demonstration of how suddenly and how completely such sway could be lost, how the whole towering edifice could come down the moment its single foundation was removed. Yet what remains, when the authority is gone and the beauty is dust, is the figure of the woman herself, and it is a figure of remarkable strength. For the Duchess de Poitiers was, whatever else she was, a woman of extraordinary self-command, who took the materials that fortune gave her birth and her loveliness and her wits, and shaped from them a life of her own deliberate making, and who held to her chosen course through triumph and disaster alike with an unbroken composure. She made herself a deity and lived as one and fell as one, never losing her dignity, never breaking, never giving her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her dismayed. There is a coldness in this, but there is also a greatness, and the greatness is real. For in the end the residences outlasted the influence, and the art outlasted the loveliness, and the myth she had so carefully made outlasted the woman herself, so that what survives of her de Poitiers is, fittingly, the thing she most deliberately created, the image of the goddess in black and white. And so she comes down to us, the lady in her dark and pale scheme, the moon goddess of the Valois court, the widow who captured a king and the favourite who lost everything, a figure poised forever between the cool and the magnificent, between the calculating and the noble. She built houses that still stand, inspired art that still survives, fashioned a myth that still fascinates, and lived a life that still, after 500 years, compels our attention and our wonder. Whether we admire her or distrust her, we cannot easily forget her, for she made of herself something unforgettable, a deliberate and finished work, Diane in her Temple of Moons, and with that image of her, the lady at rest in the mansion she built, it is time to bring our lengthy evening together, gently toward its close. We have travelled far together tonight, all the way from a manor mansion of the old French nobility to the splendours of the Valois court, and from the bright noon of a favourite's power to the quiet evening of a noble lady's retirement. We have followed she through the whole lengthy arc of her remarkable life, from the girl of the old nobility through the dutiful young wife and the disciplined widow in the severe livery, to the woman who captured the heart of a king and held it for 30 years and made herself into a living goddess. We have seen her at the height of her influence, throned beside the king, mistress of Chenonceau and builder of Anet, the uncrowned Queen of France, and we have seen her lose it all in a single summer afternoon and withdraw, unbroken, into the magnificent retreat she had been wise enough to prepare. And perhaps, lying there in the quiet, you have caught some sense of the puzzle of her, the way the warmth and the calculation lived side by side in the one heart, the way she turned even her own face into something as carefully made as the palaces she raised. She was not, perhaps, a woman easy to take to the heart, but she was an arresting one to consider, and her unbroken command of herself, her refusal to be broken by any blow, leaves an impression that lingers in the mind long after the lamp is out. It has been a quiet pleasure to wander through her life in your company, to follow her from the manor to the court, and from the court to the House of Moons, and to try to see, behind the myth and the legend, the real woman who lived and ruled and fell so long ago. If these slow journeys into the lives of the past are a good way for you to ease the mind and let the day fall away, then you would be most welcome to come and travel with me again. On the other evenings I have set down, and there are many more of them waiting whenever you should like them, other lives and other ages to disappear into for a while. You are welcome to follow along, so that these evenings can find their way back to you. And if there is some figure from the past you have always wondered about, someone whose story you would like us to wander through together, I would love for you to leave me a note about it, for I look through them with great pleasure. But that is for another night, and for now there is nothing left to do but to let the candles burn low and the old story fade, and to let the Lady of Anet, with all her beauty and all her pride, sink softly back into the past from which we called her up. You have travelled a long way tonight, all the way across the glittering and dangerous world of Renaissance France, and now it is time to set the journey down and let yourself drift the rest of the way into sleep. Let the palaces fade, and the crescent moons, and the sound of my voice, and let the warm dark carry you gently down into rest. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. good night.